executive director of the Center for Technology and Civic Life. They helped run, I think, a more than $250 million program financed largely by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to support state and local election officials. So I want to hear more about how that project went. And after that, we will turn to Danielle Kreis and his colleague Bridget Barrett at UNC Chapel Hill. They have been studying for years the policies that platforms have enacted to manage and govern political ads. And these policies vary quite widely by platform and have some, I think, really interesting democratic sort of values trade-offs that these policies pose. So we'll want to hear more about that. After that, we will turn at 11 a.m. to hear from Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta, who run the Internet Observatory here at the Cyber Policy Center. And they ran a massive elections integrity project in partnership with 3 other groups to try and address election-related disinformation. Following that, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we will turn to a panel with the platforms, hearing from leads at each of the main social media platforms about their experience in the 2020 elections. We'll hear from Nathaniel Gleischer, who is the head of cybersecurity policy at Facebook, from Clement Wolf, who is the global public policy lead for information integrity at Google, from Yoel Roth, the director of site integrity at Twitter, and from Eric Hahn, the head of safety at TikTok. We'll have a Q&A there. So again, at this session and throughout the day, just go ahead and enter questions in the Q&A box, and there's an upvoting function so that you're able to go ahead and let us know which questions you're most interested in hearing, and I will do my best to moderate those. And then we will close promptly at 1 p.m. So with that, I want to turn and just get us started and turn to Nate Persily, who again, as I said, is the faculty co-director at the Cyber Policy Center, who launched and led the Healthy Elections Project that was working to assist officials and the public to create safe polling places, which was no small task, given that we have something like 10,000 different election jurisdictions in the US. Rolling out best practices to all of them is certainly complicated. And Nate, as I recall, was also tracking something like the more than 400 cases, legal cases challenging nearly every aspect of the election process that we've seen. So Nate, would love to just hear 10 minutes or so from you about how that went, anything that we're still concerned about moving forward before we get to inauguration, and then we'll save 10 minutes for Q&A with you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm going to blow through 10 slides in 10 minutes, I hope. Thank you, everybody, the audience, for attending, and especially this group of speakers. I know firsthand how much our time is being occupied by these kind of webinars these days, and so I really appreciate you sharing the time. Let me share my screen, and can you see that okay, Kelly? I just want to make sure, since I recently, perfect. Good. I recently did a webinar where I spoke for 15 minutes, and then they said, "Are you sharing slides?" So I don't want to be in that position again. All right. So okay. I'm going to talk about. Let me talk about the Healthy Elections Project briefly, and then talk a little. Try to introduce the topic for today a little bit, and the way I'm thinking about issues of digital technology, social media, and the 2020 election. As Kelly mentioned, when the pandemic hit, the Hewlett Foundation turned to me and Charles Stewart, a professor at MIT and the nation's leading expert on election science, to try to develop at least some academically grounded effort to help local election officials in adapting to the pandemic. And so this became a bigger project than we expected, I would say, at the time. You can see all of the work that we put together at healthyelections.org. We have over 1,000 pages of research that were there. We had over 175 Stanford students who were part of this. We partnered with all kinds of organizations like CTCL, which is on the call, and Democracy Works, Center for Election Innovation and Research, Elections Group, and the like. To try to, as Kelly mentioned, to do 2 things: to make sure that in-person voting was safe and secure, and then that mail voting the transition to mail voting could be done in a safe and secure way. And I think to some extent, we forget right now where we were last spring, where it looked like there was a good chance of a complete meltdown. We had poll worker shortages to the point where 97% of polling places were closed in Milwaukee in the Wisconsin primary. They had to bring out the National Guard in Wisconsin and elsewhere to run the election. You saw error rates of upwards of 20% in New York for their mail balloting system. And we really, as we approached the fall, I think we were in a pretty desperate situation. But, you know, the election officials really stepped up. And what happened was, in addition to the $400 million that came through from Congress through the CARES Act, you know, as Kelly mentioned, generous philanthropic money came in to help sustain and buttress local election offices. And civil society really mobilized to help these election officials with all kinds of assistance in training. Particularly since John F. Johnson is here, I'll let her really talk about their effort. But you cannot overstate the significance of what the Center for Technology and Civic Life was able to accomplish with the help of election administrators. And I do think, you know, we've in certain circles at least, we've been singing the praises of election officials throughout the last 2 months. And let me add to that praise now. What they were able to pull off, Republicans and Democrats alike, was really quite remarkable. But as I said, there was this civil society mobilization. An example of that is in the area of poll worker recruitment. And this does have a digital flavor to it, since it was all basically done through the web. And that is the powerthepolls.org, which was able to recruit over 500,000 people to sign up through its website to volunteer to be in polling places. How many of those, that 500,000, actually end up in polling places? I don't know, but in the end, we did not see the kind of poll worker shortages that many expected on election day. And it extended right beyond some of these new organizations to everything from the NBA to businesses, NBA contributing their arenas and stuff to polling places and the like. What we did in the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, I mentioned the extensive research that we did, also working on poll worker recruitment. Kelly mentioned the litigation tracker, and you can still, this is the gift that keeps on giving. So we have over 500 cases that are in that database that you can see if you go to the litigation tracker there. And then we worked with the Stanford Design School to provide materials, digital materials and paper materials for polling places, secretaries of state and the like, to try to educate voters and to help train poll workers. And some of this was done through the partnership with CTCL. And then lots of course, public engagement from Charles and me and others on what we should do in this election. And you know, where we ended up was that this was the most significant change in national election infrastructure that we've had in US history, and we did it in the shortest period of time. If you look at places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, North Carolina, which had historic rates of mail balloting of 5% or so, roughly half or 40 to 50% of their voters ended up voting by mail. And we had minimal problems, despite what you've seen in the post-election period, right? We don't, the final data are not there, but it doesn't seem like many of the problems that we saw in the primary period, dealing with lateness, dealing with rejections and the like, were significant this time. And you didn't see long lines in polling places. You didn't see poll worker shortages, despite record high turnout, right? 159 million people turned out to vote, setting records in every state, and highest turnout in over 100 years. Of the eligible voter population, roughly 2/3 of Americans showed up to vote. But nevertheless, despite this incredible success, there's extreme partisan polarization in the performance of election administration and rates of fraud and the like. So now let me just turn quickly to the issue that we're talking about today, and that's the impact of technology on the 2020 election. I want to talk about it in 3 different domains, just to provide teasers for the material that our colleagues are going to present later in the day. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the voting infrastructure and the impact of technology the actual mechanics of voting. Second, on campaign and group activity and what we may have seen, and even though the data is still coming in. And then also how the platforms behaved and what the policy changes were. So let me just say sort of two prefatory remarks here, which is that I've always sort of questioned how in the 2016 election, how significant, say, the digital environment independently was as compared to other aspects of the campaign and the like. In 2020, the pandemic forced us, right, to act digitally in ways that we we wouldn't have otherwise. And I'll talk a little bit about voter registration and mobilization efforts, but that that digital technology became increasingly important when we were all trapped at home, sort of an obvious point to make. But there are things like face-to-face voter registration drives, which could not really get off the ground for much of the spring and summer. And so digital tools became increasingly important. But conversely, or to complicate matters, that it is increasingly difficult to define what is the digital world and what is the non-digital world. My son, who both plays Animal Crossing and watches a lot of Hulu, was confronted by Biden and other political ads in both of those environments, right, leading up to this election. What is it? How do we start thinking about the pervasiveness of digital technologies and the merging of the legacy and sort of information ecosystem and digital technology? So I have a little bit to say on that. Okay, so let me just talk quickly about the voting infrastructure and then move on to the other more issues that we tend to think of when we think about social media and the election. When I was the research director of the President's Commission on Election Administration, now about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, this was the commission that President Obama put together, that the lawyers for Romney and Obama's campaign put together to deal with the problems like long lines on election day. One of the main reforms that we urged was online voter registration. The online voter registration technology also became salient in 2016 because of potential vulnerabilities there. But suffice it to say that now almost, the lion's share of states, probably 80% of them or so, now allow for online voter registration, which of course was particularly critical during the pandemic because you had everyone, you didn't have the face-to-face voting registration drives and the like. Second, I want to talk about mail balloting technology and the significance of that going forward. We have a whole set of research papers on both ballot tracking and signature verification at healthyelections.org. I encourage you to take a look at those. Because of the controversies that we've seen post-election, the importance of ballot tracking technology in this, I think, is only going to grow going forward. Depending on the state, you are either better or worse able to track your ballot. But it's something that is a critical security feature in the mail balloting process that was rolled out in numerous jurisdictions. Michigan, in particular, adopted Ballot Scout, developed by Democracy Works, and rolled it out without significant problems, as did many other jurisdictions. The issue of signature verification is now making its way into court and in lawsuits in Nevada and the like. So the use of AI to deal with signature verification is now something I think we're going to be thinking about in reform in the coming months. But that's another area of technology. Most of what in the post-election period, when people have been talking about technology, the idea of dominion comes in. And actually just today, there's a conspiracy theory on the left about ES&S products in Kentucky. I can only tell you that these are conspiracy theories, that there are paper trails for all of these. Over 90% of Americans voted on paper in this election, and there's no evidence of any machine problems. Quickly on campaign group activity, I think both Daniel Kreis and Laura Edelman and Erica Franklin Fowler are going to go over this quite a bit, and Bridget Barrett also. That the we've seen obviously the lurch toward greater digital involvement that we've seen in the previous elections. We've now seen, of course, increase significantly in the 2020 election in fundraising, in voter registration and mobilization, in the number, in the share of ads that are bought digitally as compared to television. But as I said, it's becoming, I think, increasingly difficult to distinguish between the purchases on the digital side and those in the legacy system, much as the way that we study this, I think, depends on that. And then, of course, the use of organic content. As I've written elsewhere, and even in these post-election postmortems that we've done, it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between what is paid content and what is organic content. The example of Michael Bloomberg paying influencers in the primary period in order to get his message out is an example of how the typical boxes that we try to put paid content and organic content in are becoming increasingly difficult to draw. Lastly, on platform policy, since I'm 1 minute over already, the environment on Facebook and Google and Twitter this time was quite different than 4 years ago, and in response to what happened a lot 4 years ago. The new advertising archives, right, just speaking about advertising, right, provided an opportunity for people to study this. Of course, as Laura has shown, those archives are both inadequate and in need of supplement by outside researchers who should be able to scrape the ad archives for information as well as the platforms, but that's another debate. Second, we saw new measures being taken by the platforms, whether it was Twitter banning political ads, though the folks at UNC that have shown how difficult it's been to define some of these categories, as well as Facebook banning in the last week of the campaign new advertisements that had not been shown on Facebook prior to that 7-day ban. I suspect that the platforms will talk quite a bit about the communication regulation, how they deleted, whether it's tweets or content that was coming even out of the mouth of the President of the United States, demoted it, distracted with a variety of different flags, whether it was, that this claim is disputed or that the presidential election has been called for President Biden, President-elect Biden, as well as, a variety of disclosures that would accompany these items. Finally, I want to emphasize the role that the platforms played in providing information, not just regulating the information environment, but the Voting Information Center at Facebook, which was then sort of the repository for a lot of the civic information that would be used to counteract some of the messages online, I think was a much more robust kind of feature on the platforms. And the Google Civic API, was which was provided, the information provided by Democracy Works was really a critical backbone for all kinds of digital efforts to try to provide information on polling places, how to vote, and the like. I'll just say, one last thing on this, which is that the pandemic, right, changed the digital environment for elections in many ways. One of them, I think, is that the rules and practices that were adopted by the platforms to deal with COVID-related disinformation over the summer and spring then had kind of spillover effects into the way they thought about regulating communication in the election. I think and so that all of the aggressiveness that they showed in the COVID environment and dealing with medical disinformation, I think then set a precedent for how they deal with political information. We will see whether they will be as aggressive going forward, either in the US or especially in other countries, and whether they'll be as willing to censor other political leaders and the like. As I said, the paradox, though, is that we had this incredibly successful election, but because of the signals that are being sent particularly by the president, in the post-election period. We have this incredible polarization and lack of trust in the result. And I will end there. I went a little bit over time, but I'll take 5 minutes of questions, Kelly, if you can.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Nate. And thank you. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left. So for folks who have questions, go ahead and enter those in the Q&A, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and start with one of mine, which is to ask, specifically when it comes to mail-in voting, so setting aside disinformation and things like that for the moment, what do you anticipate the main implications will be for voting in future years? Like, what has changed now? As I understand it, NCSL, the National Council on State Legislators, their tracking of how many states are doing mail-in voting, it's really only something like 5 that I saw that were fully mail-in for any elections. How do you see what we've learned in 2020 and what folks have achieved this year, the implications for future elections?
So I think that there was, to some extent, the pandemic has accelerated trends that were already in the offing. And so we here in California had 2/3 of our ballots in previous elections we had cast by mail. And now every Californian received a mail ballot. And I think it's going to be hard for some states to roll back, right? So in states, particularly Democratic controlled states that have now pushed the envelope on mail balloting, I think that you're going to see a lot of those changes stick. The problem is that the issue of mail balloting has now become so polarized that you will see retrenchment in some other places, right? Right now, there's a hearing in Georgia on this topic, or was 2 hours ago, on the issue of mail balloting, expanded mail balloting. And so I think we now have reached a new plateau when it comes to mail balloting. And I think that we're going to end up having high rates of it, but it's going to be very regionally variant. But I think that there are all kinds of other things that, changes that were made in the system to deal with the pandemic, like moving to, even in the places that aren't going to have high rates of mail balloting, moving to no excuse absentee balloting. The advent of ballot drop boxes, which a lot of states had not had before, right? The use of technology by local election officials, right? I think that one thing, you had, I talked about the platforms before. It seems to be difficult. It would be remarkable if the platforms now went back and gave less information in future elections than they did this time. So the kind of blessing and the curse of the Facebook Voting Information Center is that they've now set a standard for the kind of information that people are going to expect from the platforms going forward. So I think there is a lot of that is going to stick.
Great. 2 other questions in the last 2 minutes that we have remaining. One, the impact of the provision of extra funding from the federal government. I mean, I remember when HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, was passed, new equipment was bought, there were no more funds for that. I remember you saying, I don't know, back in maybe May or June, that $400 million was barely going to be enough for the postage stamps required. What do you think about the money that was spent, the money that was needed, and what this bodes for additional funding from the government going forward?
Well, so we cannot, have a bake sale for democracy every 4 years, right? We cannot be in the position that we were in this year, where you had private philanthropy that, was kicked in $500 million almost, all told, or maybe a little bit less. We can ask Gianna how much it was, but that we need to, I hope that one thing that would come out of this election is a permanent source of funds to local election administrators to pull off this election. There was just a critical shortage of money. $400 million in the CARES Act was certainly not enough. Private philanthropy stepped up. I think the shift to mail balloting relieved a lot of the stress on the polling places. But yeah, I think that that's one thing one would hope that coming out of this election, so we have a permanent source of funds.
Great, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions coming in and not enough time. So those that are related to the platforms, I'm going to try and save for later panels, because I think others can address these and focus on just the ones I think are specifically only you can answer. So thoughts about Georgia and how much you're tracking the runoffs there, and what to be concerned about. And then a question about Pennsylvania. and whether that is a quote unquote Democrat controlled state, and how to think about Pennsylvania moving forward. And then a question about why can't there be national standards for voting,
Okay.
the mess that is all of these jurisdictions.
Okay, well, to keep us on time, I'll just answer those last two because I think we're right at the end here. The Pennsylvania, no, Pennsylvania is not Democratic controlled. He's right, it's split. He or she is right. And but the Secretary of State and the governor are Democrats, and obviously a lot of the local election jurisdictions are run by Democrats. But one of the things we showed, if you look at the New York Times article that Charles Stewart and I wrote, is that you don't see, if anything, a place like Philadelphia had surprisingly both relatively low voter turnout and relatively low shares for President-elect Biden. So you don't see any partisan bias that has been alleged there. The other question was about, national standards. Is that the other one? So look, we do need a floor on certain things like maybe national standards on days of early voting, or particularly regulations of the Postal Service, because ordinarily we don't think we have a national election monitor in the US, but when a third or more of the votes are being cast by mail, the US Postal Service becomes that national election authority. So I think that we do need greater legislation here, but one of the things the pandemic showed, one of the things any of us who've worked in this field know, is that there's such great diversity between the local jurisdictions that national mandates often have perverse effects, and that you really have to be sensitive to what would be a kind of floor requirement of above which or below which the jurisdictions can't fall, as opposed to micromanaging the local jurisdictions in every aspect of the voting system.
Great. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll have time for a full Q&A with all of our panelists at 12:30 at the end, so we can take up some further questions there. With that, I would love to turn to Erica Franklin-Fowler. Erica, it's great to see you. It's been a long time. Erica is director of the Wesleyan Media Project, which she helped to fund in 2010 to track and analyze advertising by federal and I believe gubernatorial candidates in real time during elections, and has a wealth of knowledge about political spending in the US. I know that this election cycle was unprecedented. It blew through even our wildest expectations of how much might be spent. I think we clocked in somewhere around $14 billion in total spending on federal elections, which was the most expensive election in US history by a long shot. I believe 2008, 12, and 16 all sort of hovered around $6 billion. Would love to just hear, what all was spent, where and how it was spent, and especially you have been tracking the transition from, big expensive TV ad buys to a growth over the years in digital ad buys. And so would love to hear, where it came from and how it was spent.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen, if hopefully I can grab the right one. And then show you a lot of pictures. So first things first, the Wesleyan Media Project has tracked political advertising in real time for a decade now. And most of our work, as was already noted, revolved around television advertising. Though we did start to incorporate digital ads from commercial sources in 2016. But obviously, once the platform libraries became available in the summer of 2018, there's now a flood of additional data to track. And I think the one prefacing comment I'd like to make, and then I know we're going to dig into the details, and especially with Laura's presentation following mine, is that because none of the libraries are consistent, the cross-platform tracking is an enormous undertaking. And before I say anything else, I need to acknowledge the enormous amount of work that is conducted from the Wesleyan Media Project team, my two co-directors, Michael Franz at Bowdoin College and Travis Ridout at Washington State University, the Quantitative Analysis Center Associate Director here, Pavel Olinikov, and our WMP staff, Laura Baum and Colleen Bogutsky, and then the cadre of students that we have who make our work possible. We simply couldn't do what we do without them, and we're very pleased to have new students working on our Delta Lab, which is a computational testing ground for a lot of the work that we're doing. there's a lot left to process and a lot to say and a lot still to come. And so what I will give you is a taste of what we know now, with the caveat that there will be much more to be said about the 2020 election cycle. But to start us off, big picture federal election activity, if we look at the September 1st through election day timeframe, looking at, and I'm going to be speaking quickly, so I'm happy to take question and answers afterwards. If we look at traditionally tracked television, and by that I mean broadcast television, national broadcast, national network television, and national cable, and then Facebook and Google. Across those sets, it looks like roughly $3 billion was spent between September 1st and Election Day on advertising on those places. And roughly 25% of that came from the platforms, Facebook and Google, roughly evenly divided between them. If we turn to specifically to the presidential election, and I'm going to expand the time frame just a little bit to go back to April. These are Cantor Media CMAG estimates. I'm going to also expand the landscape to go beyond the traditionally. So what I mean by traditionally tracked TV is the television data for which we have long-standing tracking data that go back now 2 decades to 2000. What you see is the proportion of activity. If we look at Biden and Trump in particular, television dominates. It's over 50% if we include those traditionally tracked sources, but you can see there's a lot of variation even among that. So 40% of Biden's spending came on local broadcast, 39% of Trump's came on that. You can see interesting differences in the way in which they looked at the national sources. So Trump in particular relied a little more heavily on national cable spend than did Biden. Digital spend, again, fairly large differences across the two campaigns. Biden spending, Trump, it was much higher across all, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but Biden spent roughly 25% of his activity on the digital landscape, whereas Trump spent, just under 40%. We do think that's a difference from the 2016 election, where the Trump campaign said that they had roughly divided their spending 50-50 between digital and television. So certainly some changes in that landscape. I'm going to turn to TV first in the presidential race and then come back to digital. So looking at the presidential election cycle, I'm giving you here on the left. So when we think about television advertising, we generally at the Wesleyan Media Project prefer to talk about ad volume because we know it is more accurate. The television spending is always an estimate. And so the left side, but I'm going to give you spending because that's the easiest way to compare across to the digital platforms. So as you look at the left-hand side, you see television spending by week. And then on the right-hand side is television ad volume by week. And what you can see here is a little bit of variation. There certainly were some periods early on in the presidential general election period where Trump was outspending Biden, but obviously large gaps as we proceed into the fall with Biden activity largely outweighing the Trump campaign. On this slide, I'm giving you, now I do want you to note the difference in the axis here. On the left-hand side is the television spending. And again, this is traditionally tracked television. So it would include local broadcast, national cable, national network television. The television spending by week. And then on the right-hand side, you see the campaign spending on Facebook and Google in particular. Note the difference in the y-axis. So obviously television is much, much higher, but as you look at the platform differences across the two candidates on Facebook and Google, you find some interesting things that Google advertising actually was slightly higher at the very end of the campaign. And certainly also, although Biden was out-airing Trump and outspending him on television, you do see a little bit more variation in the digital spend, in particular across platform and across time. If we look combining spending overall by geography from September through Election Day, these graphic built by one of our students is showing the distribution of spend by Biden on the left and Trump on the right. Roughly 12 million was spent by each candidate in Florida, and Biden also spent another 12 million in Pennsylvania on Facebook, whereas Trump spent roughly half of that, which is 6 million. If we take a look at some of the key states that were key in the 2016 election, because those were the places that we were paying special attention to, you notice that there was some difference in spending over time in Florida in particular, that Donald Trump definitely had advantages in Facebook spending in Florida early on during even if we just limit to the fall election cycle post-September. But Biden obviously took over towards the end. If we back up and look at what do we know about the 2020 election cycle overall, the 2020 presidential tone, at least as measured by television, and I'm happy to talk about the difference between television and online in Q&A, 2020 was a quote unquote nicer presidential year. And you can see this is true on the left panel, whether we look at the full general election campaign of the presidential year or whether we limit to just the post-Labor Day period forward. That 2020 had fewer what we would call pure attack ads. And even overall, if we were going to combine the contrast ads, which would include a mention of the opponent, even if we include both of those things, 2020 was slightly more positive than prior election years. But what that hides is very different strategies between the two candidates. So this graph on the top is giving you the volume of airings, but broken down by the type of tone that each airing was. And then on the bottom, you can see the percentages. And so certainly you'll see here first that pro-Biden airings were overwhelmingly dominating the pro-Trump ones, which you already know. But what you see on this graphic is how it differed in terms of tone. And you see that the both Biden's campaign and the groups that were airing on his behalf were much less likely to use pure attack than we have seen in the past. So certainly much heavier use of what we would call the contrast spots. There are interesting things that happen in the campaign here. And so obviously in early October with Trump's diagnosis that he had COVID, you see a drop in even the contrast ads that were mentioned there, and then they pick back up again towards the end of the campaign, but they end up on a very positive note. I think what's particularly interesting for me is if you compare the right panel, the pro-Trump ads here, the amount of negative, and by that I mean attack and contrast ads from both candidates at the very end of the election are roughly equal in volume, but then you have this massive additional amount of positive pro-Biden ads at the very end of the campaign. If we turn to congressional races, you see, again, just astonishing. We have obliterated all kinds of records for the 2020 election cycle. The House advertising was still higher than 2018, which is the previous record-breaking election, but just by a little bit. And it's really in the Senate that we see this dramatic takeoff, even from the 2018 totals. And similar to the presidential race, you can see on the right-hand side, if we plot the pro-Democratic versus pro-Republican advantages on air, you see that Democrats had advantages basically everywhere. If we wanted to look at the tone, this is a lot to look at, but I'm just giving you a big picture landscape here. On the left-hand side are the House races, and on the right-hand side are the Senate races. What I found interesting is, again, similar patterns to the presidential race. We have more pro-Democratic ads than we have Republican ones, but certainly also more negativity in House races, which I found somewhat interesting, and we can dig into if you'd like in Q&A. In terms of outside group activity on federal races, the 2020 election cycle actually saw the proportion dip slightly. But again, I think what's important to emphasize here is that doesn't necessarily mean fewer ads, because we had such a dramatic increase in the amount of ads on air. And if we were to look and dig into dark money organizations and dark money activity, this table put together in collaboration with our partners at the Center for Responsive Politics shows you the percentages of dark money, the percentages of partial disclosure, and then the total number of airings. And certainly the number of airings in these outside group activity is much higher. I think I'll stop there in the interest of more discussion, but happy to talk about any of those trends in more detail.
Great, Erica. Thank you so much. As always, it's incredibly impressive to see how much you are able to pull together in a relatively short period of time. And I cannot imagine how you manage coding the negative versus, promoting and all those other ads. So thank you for that. Questions most welcome. I have a couple and others are starting to come in. You had indicated that you might be able to differentiate between the niceness, and I was shocked, by the way, to hear that this was a nicer election cycle than we've seen in past years, but appreciate the differences between the different campaigns. Did you see a big difference on television versus social media in terms of the overall positivity or constructiveness of these ads?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to dive into our definitions here, and both in terms of the way political scientists typically think about tone of advertising. It's actually a very objective measure and one that differs from what citizens might expect. So we classify in this it's a 3-category classification. An attack ad is, except for the paid for byline, an ad where you focus solely on your opponent. A promotional ad would be an ad where you focus solely on yourself. And then by definition, then a contrast ad includes some of both. It might be overwhelmingly attack, or it might be overwhelmingly promote, but we're putting those all in the same category. And what's really interesting, if we look at television versus social media in particular, is that by those definitions, television advertising is much more negative than online ads. And that was true in our extensive look at the 2018 cycle, but also true if we look at the 2020 cycle. But I think what's important to acknowledge is, of course, that that's not everything if we think about tone. And so the other thing that we do know in our extensive look at television versus Facebook is that Facebook ads are also, they're less negative by this definition, but they're also more partisan. In other words, they can more easily be predicted by your partisanship based on the language that is included and potentially other, key references. And so I do not think, and I want to be clear, I do not think that citizens will necessarily think that this was a more positive election. I mean, certainly there are many more ads on television. There were many more ads that citizens were encountering online and everywhere. And I do think the extent to which those ads can be easily sorted out, which party is being supported in each, those will feel negative, even if we wouldn't by our definition count them as negative. And so I think that's an important way to sort of think about it. But certainly from our perspective, we do know that negative ads through our definition are more likely to include some mostly typically policy information, at least on television. Online, you'll find a little bit less substance. It's going to be more, quick partisan quips between the two. But certainly we do think that and I should also say the 2020 election cycle did see a return back to more policy on television than we saw in the 2016 election, at least as far as the Democratic ads were concerned.
Great, thank you. We have 3 or so minutes left, and I'm going to try and group 3 or 4 questions so you can decide which you want to answer. There are quite a few on race, gender, what we know about demographics and how targeting was done. I'm not sure. I'm suspecting Laura may have tracked some of this also in her work, and we'll get to that. But really curious what we know about, language. And I noticed in some of your charts you had talked about, I think Biden had done more with Hispanic television advertising. But anything you can tell us about race, demographic targeting?
Yeah, there's some really interesting, that first graph had shown, so the first table had shown some of the differences in the Hispanic television, in particular broadcast television, where Biden spent more. If we look at the digital landscape, we actually had a student who I'm hoping her analysis will be posted soon. She was looking at Spanish language advertising on Facebook in particular. And when she looked halfway through the fall cycle, so midway through October, she was finding a lot more of Trump activity that was Spanish language on Facebook. But then that sort of reversed as election day approached. And so Biden ends up with a higher proportion, but certainly differences in the way the campaigns were approaching them. So again, it's challenging to look at demographics across all of these sources. Certainly, we get bucketed information from the platform libraries about who saw what, but even the Facebook landscape in particular, because they're not showing you targeting information, they're only showing you impression-based information. It's harder for us to sort out whether the campaigns are showing more healthcare ads to women because they think that women are going to be more moved by those ads, or whether the algorithm itself is pushing some more healthcare ads to women because they think that women will be more interested in them. But certainly there are some differences across both gender and racial data is not available in the online archives. We can obviously infer some of it from the language and other places. And then for the television landscape, what we would do is look at program-based ad buys to try to sort out some of that information. But I would say too, because I haven't mentioned it, obviously the issue focus of these two campaigns differed quite dramatically, even if we just look at television. But of course, the online environment is going to give you even more variation with, Trump in particular taking much of the summer to talk about crime in particular, and then sort of turning back to talking about the economy and COVID towards the fall.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're just about out of time, but I can't help with one more question for you. On Congress, why more attack ads in Congress than presidential? Do you have any hypotheses there? And I was trying to process your chart quickly, but it looked like we saw a fall in dark money vis-a-vis 2016. And I'm wondering what you might attribute that to also.
Yeah, so two things. I think the congressional ads were, especially the House, was a much more similar amount of volume to the prior years. And so the distribution of ads, therefore, is also similar. So it's not as if House was more negative than it ever has been. It was just consistently negative, sort of at the rates that it has always been. So I think that's part of what we saw in House ads. And also, I think the constraints of House candidates when you're competing in media markets where there may also be a presidential contest, a competitive contest, and a Senate contest in particular, there are only so many ads you're going to air. And so you're going to stick to sort of the traditional approach of the allocation of your tone. And so to me, that's probably what explains it, but I'm sure there's more to dig in there as well. Certainly, I think there is so with respect to the dark money and the partial disclosure, I think there's more to sort out there. We did see more carry packs, and we saw a fair amount of an increase in the partial disclosure category. So certainly the dark money in particular may have gone down slightly, but I think if you look across the full bucket of the fully transparent, certainly we're still seeing more ads from those groups.
Great. Erica, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. We want to now turn to Laura. And as I said, Laura Edelson is at New York University, and she and her colleague, Damon McCoy, is a professor of computer science at NYU. A couple years ago, launched the NYU Ad Observatory, and this September really helped refine that, which is intended to help reporters and researchers and others really easily analyze political ads, in particular from Facebook, because as we've discussed, the ad archive that Facebook has put together has a variety of challenges associated with it. And Erica, I'm remembering these conversations years ago with you, and they continue. And Laura also. We've been talking about this for some time. I think, as we know, television broadcasters must disclose information about political ads to the public. Facebook and other platforms face no such federal requirements, so it's been a bit of a hodgepodge trying to piece this together. Laura, you launched this project to help with that. And then, as I recall, seeing in my Twitter feed one day that the Wall Street Journal had covered Facebook's attempt to shut down your project, and I was feeling for you certainly at that time, I think we all were. They had stated that it violated provisions in Facebook's terms of service that prohibit bulk data collection, something I think every scholar in this field struggles with. So would love to hear, what you learned from the project, what you learned from the experience of trying to improve transparency in this space. And we'll have about 10 minutes for that. And then if folks want to enter questions in the Q&A, that would be great. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Kelly. So yeah, today I'm mostly going to be talking about our more general election efforts, not our current difficulties, but let me start my presentation. Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to be talking about our 2020 election monitoring results. So just to give you a little bit of some context on, who we are. I'm a PhD candidate at NYU. I work with Damon McCoy. He's my advisor, and a lot of this work was done with Paul Duke. He's our lead engineer, and we're computer scientists, and our particular focus is on cybersecurity. We work out of the NYU Center for Cybersecurity. So while, I think Erica can give you so much great context on the political science aspect here, our focus is really on this as a cybersecurity problem to solve. And so our approach there is we really think we need to look at the entire ecosystem of political advertising, and really think about how we can audit that, and how we can develop tools for functional transparency. So we focus on Facebook data. We do this for a couple of reasons. First, Facebook is just undeniably the 800-pound gorilla in the political digital ad space. But second, because Facebook has been much more transparent about the political ad data that they have than other platforms, and they really do deserve a lot of credit for that. We do augment the data that we collect from Facebook's ad library API with ad targeting data that is anonymously collected by users of our browser extension, and that's Ad Observer. And then we kind of combine everything together, and then we do quite a bit of secondary analysis to cluster ads together into ad campaigns. We do everything from extracting named entities, we classify ads by their topic and purpose, and we evaluate sentiment and politicalness. I don't have a great other word for it. And then we try to surface that data in a couple of ways. So first, and probably most notably, we launched a public website, Ad Observatory. It's currently inactive. But during the election, it allowed users to see spend in particular races, broken down by topic, by ad type, and by ad type we sort of mean, is this ad intended to solicit a donation, to get out the vote, that kind of thing, as well as geography. Users could also browse individual ad campaigns and see summaries of that kind of metadata on the advertiser level as well. In addition to our more public-facing efforts, we built a tool that was solely focused on screening ads for problematic content. Now, we're computer scientists, we're not experts in any of these communities that were being targeted with misleading ads. So we partnered with several civil society groups that do have that expertise, and they used our site and our data to flag problematic stuff they saw and run investigations to try to uncover some of the most problematic advertisers. And sometimes we would just send that content back to Facebook. Sometimes they would do their own public reports. But in general, our goal was to try to learn from what they were flagging and try to begin to detect some of the patterns that we hope will eventually be usable for developing more extensive screening systems and maybe even eventually some mitigations. So what did we find? So before I get into the problems, I want to start by just stating the obvious. The vast majority of spending in political advertising is very normal activity by established political actors, campaigns. Obviously a huge bulk of the spend we observed was just by Donald Trump and Joe Biden across a wide range of Facebook pages. And just the reason I want to call this out is that I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the problems, but really the vast majority of political advertisers they're honest actors. And the reason we want to look at these problems is so that we can develop solutions so that this larger community and users can function within a system that they can trust. And there really is a lot of interest and social utility in better, more functional transparency of that healthy, regular political advertising activity. So we tried to keep track of news stories that used our data to tell readers and viewers about political advertising in their state, and there were dozens. Um, you know, there is a really strong public interest in what goes on in political advertising. And the idea that this data is only of interest to researchers just isn't true. So moving on to some of the problems we saw. First, there was a lot of content that denigrated mail-in voting. And to Facebook's credit, in the second week of October, they did prohibit this content, which we think was the right move. And we did see that content drop off significantly after that. The problem was a lot of the damage was done. Similarly, there was a big problem with content that denigrated our democratic system as a whole. Though this content was also banned, but we continue to see some of that really through the entire election. I think part of the problem here was that, of course, this is sort of a squishier topic. And also, this content was coming from institutions and offices that historically have a lot of social trust. President Trump engaged in this, of course, but so did quite a few other Republican candidates and local parties. And I think that this is a place where the policy carve outs that Facebook made to allow political candidates to run ads with false content has really painted them into a corner in terms of dealing with this problem. Just to dig into this very slightly, we ran a sentiment analysis of ads by topic in the month of October. And democratic norms are not the most negative topic in this list. But compared to historical data, this topic being negative at all is quite striking. And again, this is part of a larger media strategy. So this isn't only playing out in Facebook political ads, but recent polling on whether people trust the outcome of this election certainly reflect this sentiment. The last thing in my very short remaining amount of time that I wanted to talk about is just, we think that there are quite a few places where Facebook put into place good policies. However, the enforcement was just kind of shoddy. And so this took a lot of forms, but one that I think is pretty easy to illustrate is this issue that we saw with ads with a false claim that had a fact check. From what I can tell, the way that this policy was enforced was that just the single ad creative object would be removed. Other ad creatives that might have been identical weren't pulled, and advertisers were able to create new identical copies of those ads and run those. And so that would lead to weird circumstances like this, where Facebook, in their summary view on the web portal to the ad library, groups ads that have the same creative together from the same advertiser, and as they've done in this case, but they've only removed that one copy. And we saw this in many instances. This is just sort of an easy illustration. So we think there are some what we think of as easy wins here. Things, and probably first and most importantly, we really need universal ad transparency. The fact that we are able to do this with Facebook, that we are able to monitor and begin to talk about what these problems are, it's a real win. We really need to be able to do that for other platforms as well. Transparency is obviously just the first step we need to take. We really do need enhanced regulation of targeting and disclosure. I think other people can speak really well to how there is just more regulation through other mediums, and I think that's kind of where we need to get to. And lastly, we just think that there's many cases where there are really good policies in place, but they don't appear to be enforced, or the particular enforcement choices that are made are really limiting and really don't prioritize the interests of users in not being subjected to content that promotes false beliefs. So I think I've actually managed to stay in time. And so with that, I think we can go over to questions.
Great. Thanks, Laura. And yes, folks, please feel free to go ahead and enter questions in the chat box. Interesting to see your findings here and wondering what and we've heard a couple of questions around this, your perspective on, banning versus just sort of caveating ads and what makes sense as a policy there.
Yeah, that's a really hard question because, we do have to bear in mind some of these concepts of backlash effect that are real. I do think, though, that at minimum, ads that have, sort of provably false claims just shouldn't be allowed. They're not healthy for platforms. They're not healthy for users. I do think that, we do have to be mindful about things that are maybe one step back from that, how those are managed. And, you don't want to create a situation where advertisers feel like they can't engage with a platform. And I think this is where, again, it's not necessarily a hard policy, but much better communication. A lot of advertisers want to be on Facebook. They want to work with Facebook, but they feel like they can't communicate with Facebook. And users feel that way too. And that isn't even necessarily a policy shift so much as it's like an engagement shift.
Yeah. And then another question around transparency here. And I know this is something that all of us have been talking a lot about for years around how we improve transparency in this space. And I'm curious, especially as we think about, you focused here on Facebook, but we're also dealing with a lot of challenges with Google's ad archive and comparability between the two. I think, as Erica and I had talked about years ago, some people are sharing data on impressions and others are sharing data on targeting, and you can't really compare apples and oranges here. Have you attempted to work with Google's data also? Why the focus on Facebook, and what are you thinking about sort of moving forward in terms of transparency overall?
Yeah, we're actually in the process now of of incorporating Google data into what we have here. And that's certainly what we're planning to do for 2022. So we focused on Facebook because, as I said, they deserve credit for this. They have a really good ad inclusion policy where they include not just direct electioneering, but ads on social issues as well. We have a particular focus on misinformation. Most sort of misinformation, content promoting false beliefs takes place in these social issue ads. So because Facebook doesn't include that content, it's just not as useful an archive. And so, we focus on Facebook because they are doing this first step very well. That said, we have to tackle this cross-platform issue. It's so urgent and imperative. And that's why we're going there next. But I think we will have to, one, encourage the platforms to do everything they can to make more content transparent. And two, we're going to have to, I really think that citizen science projects where users can contribute ads that they've observed are going to be a path forward in the meantime.
Yeah. So there's a question about, the challenge. Well, there are a bunch of questions, I should say, about political ad governance and how do we define political ads. I think we'll talk more about that also in Daniel and Bridget's panel. As I understand it, I think Google is the only one that uses the same definition as the Federal Elections Commission for their ads. And otherwise, each of these platforms defines political ads quite differently. And then, of course, as you said, Facebook includes issue ads. Google and other platforms don't. This is a question that has plagued even the Supreme Court for decades. So it's certainly not an easy one to define a political ad. And I think we'll talk more about those sort of questions around how do we best regulate these in Daniel's session. Here, you had talked a lot about the challenges in actually implementing their policies. And I think we've experienced this around COVID too. I remember a great study from colleagues at Oxford who had found that something like 59% of COVID-related disinformation that had been debunked by the WHO was still up on Twitter weeks later, and 25 to 30% up was still up on Google and Facebook. And this is disinformation that is clearly defined, has been fact-checked, and the platforms don't face the same partisan disincentives to take it down, and they still couldn't, it seems, have gotten it down enough. So what do you attribute this lack of sort of follow through on policies to? Is it a capacity issue, a willingness issue, something else?
I mean, I'm not inside Facebook, so I can't really speak to their capacity, but at least externally, I think there's two problems here. One, I think we keep fighting the last battle, right? And the last battle was fake news, really well-defined fake news. I feel like what we've moved into is more a space where there's a lot of content that's promoting false beliefs, but isn't necessarily stating an explicit falsehood. And I think that, you know, platforms were really fixated on this fact check idea that is a good start, but we need to move into understanding that there is content. I think especially with, you know, we all know that this wave of vaccine misinformation is coming. We really have to solve this problem of understanding that there is going to be content that promotes a false belief, that is the problem we need to solve. So I think just wrapping our heads around that concept is going to be important. But then, you know, Facebook as a platform has decided that they really prioritize speech. And the way this plays out is that I understand they don't intend this to do this way, but like they wind up prioritizing the right of advertisers to say things that are misleading. The advertiser's right to be wrong over the user's interest. I guess Facebook hasn't defined it as a right, but it certainly is an interest in not being fed, really misleading content. And I think that balance needs to shift. And that's a willingness thing.
Great. Thank you, Laura. This has been really, really interesting to hear. We're going to now take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to transition to hearing from Tiana Epps-Johnson from the Center for Technology and Civic Life about their election-related work. So we'll be back in 10, and thanks all. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and jump back in and transition now to hearing from Tiana Epps Johnson, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Technology and Civic Life, which she helped found in 2012 as a team of civic technologists, trainers, researchers, election administration, and data experts, all working to help modernize the US elections. And Tiana is the recipient of the 2020 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship. She was selected to join the inaugural cohort of Obama Foundation Fellows in 2018 and was a Harvard Ash Center Tech and Democracy Fellow before that. So Tiana, it's really nice to see you again. It's been a while. I know this year has been extremely busy for CTCL. If I'm not mistaken, you guys had received something like a $250 million grant from Chan Zuckerberg, part of their $300 million investment to support nonprofits to provide assistance to city and county election officials. And then I think perhaps followed by an additional $100 million commitment. And then since then, there have been a number of lawsuits that you guys have been subject to in Michigan and Wisconsin and elsewhere, trying to block some of your work, which really has been so widely praised. So would love to just hear what you learned from this election cycle and some of the challenges that you guys are still wrestling with.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for setting the stage. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I do have a presentation to share. So let's get going. So I'm going to take the next 10 or so minutes to share a story about how a small nonprofit in the Midwest that you probably hadn't heard of prior to this year essentially did the work of a federal agency to ensure that our country's local election officials had the skills, the tools, and the funds that they needed to administer an election in 2020. I also would be remiss to say how exciting it is just to be even virtually back on the farm as a proud Stanford alum. Before sharing the story of what we did in 2020 at the Center for Tech and Civic Life, I'm going to share a brief bit about who we are and how we approach our work for those who are less familiar. We're an organization based in Chicago, and we consider ourselves a civic infrastructure organization. Our programs are focused on connecting Americans with the information that they need to become and remain civically engaged, while also working to ensure that our elections are administered in a way that's more inclusive, professional, and secure. We approach this work through two main verticals. We have a government services team, and that's the team whose work I'll really focus on today. That team year-round is supporting our country's local election officials with industry best practices, free tech solutions, and cutting-edge training to ensure that elections are more trustworthy and inclusive. On the other side of the house, our civic data team provides open source, nationwide, hyper-local civic data that answers the public's most pressing questions around civic issues like who represents me and who's on my ballot. This data powers many of the most powerful voting information and civic engagement tools online. For example, we partner with Google, who uses our data to power things like the one boxes that you find if you were to search things like California's governor on Google search. To date, these civic data sets have been accessed by the public over 300 million times. So let's transition now to talk about this wild year in local election administration. Going into this year, we already knew that election administrators across the country had a really big challenge in front of them. Data going back as far as 2019 showed off-the-chart voter enthusiasm that many expected would translate to record-setting turnout. This year was all set in an environment of misinformation and polarization and chronic underfunding of elections that has left election departments understaffed and reliant on crumbling technology. And states like Michigan and Pennsylvania had each passed great pro-voter legislation, including really improving vote-by-mail rules in each of their states. But that legislation was going to be implemented at scale for the first time in a presidential election year, which of course is a huge challenge. And then add to the mix a global pandemic. When the coronavirus first began to impact the United States, we couldn't predict at the time the full implications of the impact on our elections, but we knew that in the best case, by November, life would go back to normal, but there would be some residual concerns about in-person gathering, Or worst case, we could be in a second wave of an active pandemic during the November general. And either way, there were immediate ways that the field of election administration had to respond. This included massively increasing election departments' capacity to process voters by mail. It included keeping in-person voting locations open for those who rely on that method because it is more convenient or more accessible than voting by mail, all the while implementing public health guidelines to keep both election workers and voters safe. So with that context, here's what we did at CTCL to really do our part this year. First, in 2018, we developed in partnership with the Center for Democracy and Technology a 3-part cybersecurity training tailored to equip local election officials specifically with the tools, the skills, and the partnerships that they needed to defend our election systems from attack. Early this year, the United States Election Assistance Commission actually purchased this training from us, and it's now free and available to every local election official in the country in a self-paced format that they can take when works best for them and revisit as they need it. So prior to having this contract with the EAC, we had seen over 1,000 election officials go through this course and are really excited that it is available now for every single election official in the country. Election officials are also the source of most official voting information, and research shows that they're some of the most trusted government messengers. So it's critical that they are really well equipped to spread the word about voting. And so with that in mind, one of our core focuses coming into this year was ensuring that election officials knew how to connect the folks that they serve with accurate, understandable information in the places where voters are actually looking for it. We provided a 4-course series on communicating trusted election information that included a new course for us, I think maybe the first of its kind, on combating election information specifically from the perspective of local election officials. And across this series, we were joined by election officials representing 27 different states. And while cybersecurity and comms trainings were both planned parts of our roadmap coming into 2020, we quickly got to work connecting election officials with the best practices required to administer an election in a pandemic, where we wanted to ensure that voters weren't faced with the choice of having to choose between exercising their right to vote and protecting their own health. So the CTCL team got to work, and we developed a COVID-19 webinar series. We produced 12 webinars in total that we delivered every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 months. We recruited 24 guest speakers to share their firsthand experience with their peers. And this series really covered the range of types of experiences election officials might face in 2020. We started with a course that really helped election officials do things like take an emotional audit and think about the leadership that would be required to lead an office through such a precarious time. We covered things like the nitty-gritty details of how to effectively scale up your vote by mail and manage a huge influx of things like mail ballot request forms at a scale that you hadn't encountered before. We covered things like how to properly cite drop boxes and set up the collection so that that is done securely and regularly. And we helped election officials think about how to keep those in-person polling places and counting spaces safe for volunteers and for their election workers. All told, across this series, we were joined by election officials from 36 states. But of course, none of this work that election officials had to do to make the voting system work in a pandemic could happen without resources, and resources above and beyond what it usually takes to administer an election. Experts estimated that we were in need of nearly $4 billion to meet this moment. And Congress didn't fully come through. They only provided a fraction of what experts estimated was needed, allocating just 10% of the $4 billion to election departments. Throughout the spring, we heard from election officials in offices of every single size and type that their #1 need was funding. Tools and training were okay, but if you're going to deal with 2 times or 10 times your typical volume of mail ballots and applications for those ballots and calls from the voters about those ballots, you, for instance, need more staff and more equipment. So we launched the CTCL COVID-19 Response Grant Program. We're an election infrastructure organization, nonprofit, not a grant-making organization. So this was new territory for us. We started with what I thought was incredibly an ambitious goal. Maybe we would raise $5 million to then regrant to election departments. Had we accomplished that, it would have been the largest raise that I'd ever done in my life. It would have been double our organization budget. And all told, what actually happened was that in a matter of weeks, we created a nationwide grants program that's connected over 2,500 election departments across 49 states with critical funds that they were able to immediately put to work for their voters. By January, we will have given away almost $400 million, which is the same amount that the US Congress contributed to this election cycle. And as Kelly mentioned, $350 million of those funds came in the form of a donation from Dr. Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg to CTCL. The program from the start was about keeping election offices functioning and safe during a pandemic. So the grants spanned 4 buckets or categories of expenses. And as we know, election offices, are quite diverse. Not all are the same. Certainly not all geographies are the same, and states have different rules. So while we kept the focus on the impact of the pandemic, we also gave local election officials as much discretion as possible to use the funds in the areas of their specific highest need. And in November, we released a first look at impact, which I will share in the chat, that details the types and range of expenses that these funds allowed election officials to make. You can see that they, everything from equipment to storage to improvements to make places more accessible to communications expenses. And through a tremendous effort of our election officials, of activists across the country, through folks stepping up to be first-time poll workers, through partnerships like the unprecedented collaboration that we saw that Nate brought up through the effort of healthy elections. What was expected to be an election catastrophe actually defied expectations, and we saw an overwhelmingly smooth process at the polls. So, all told, I am walking away from this election cycle so energized because it really feels like we just did the impossible, and that the impossible was made happen by people really coming together and just each day taking the next best step to keep our democracy together. And at the same time, I'm laser focused at the center at fortifying and really reimagining our local election administration infrastructure, because the public and our election officials deserve better. And frankly, our democracy really depends on it. This was a really fragile election cycle, and we have to build for a more resilient infrastructure moving forward. So thank you. Looking forward to digging into questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiana. And honestly, just incredible what you all pulled off. Having come from a grant making organization, you can't imagine, and having done it for years, I can't even imagine what it took to accomplish that. Folks, please go ahead and enter questions in the chat box, but I have a couple for my own that I would like to start with. Nate mentioned earlier that, $400 million was invested by the US government, and I appreciate that. $400 million actually was funded through your organization, but I think Nate had joked that there can't be a bake sale for democracy every 4 years. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about next steps moving forward, if this is something that is, something that you would try and continue to do in future elections, recognizing we will hopefully have very different needs in future elections. But what did you learn from this in terms of next steps?
Yeah, so it looks like I shared my speaker notes. So Nate, this presentation, it was on me that did the Zoom mishap. But when I'm thinking about what comes next, first, sustained public predictable funding of elections has to be the North Star. And it has to be funding that's actually grounded in 21st century election administration. And what I mean by that is that the responsibilities of election officials have changed drastically over the last 15 years. if we just take, for example, in the last 4 years, election officials now need to be cybersecurity experts. This cycle, they had to be public health experts. There has been many other changes, mainly driven by the way that technology has changed the way that we interact with all sorts of entities, including government. And the way that we think about the structure of an election office really hasn't changed along with that. And so when we're thinking about funding, there is the piece around, yes, we need to figure out what it looks like to have public sustained funding for election administration. We also need to really examine what it looks like to have a robust election office and start from that place, a 21st century election office, rather than from the constraints that we know. So that piece of work of really defining what it takes to run a high functioning metro, suburban, rural election office is the type of work that we're going to be interrogating. And I think where we land from that may look like helping equip election officials to better advocate for themselves for the resources that they need on a regular basis. It may look like examining whether there is a short-term role for additional supplementary funding from the private sector for elections. It will also certainly look like sharing really the rich things that we're learning about the ways that election officials have used these funds, because I think that helps to tell the story of how granular and specific the work of election administration is, and how important it is to make sure that every single part of the mechanics have what they need to be successful.
Great, thank you. And we have a question in here about your partnership with CISA, which is for those who on the line who aren't familiar, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency that until recently Chris Krebs was running, that was founded, I believe, in 2018 to oversee a lot of this. I know you also mentioned your partnership with Democracy Works, and Seth Flaxman there has done just remarkable work, and I think really deserves a shout out also. So would love to hear more about those partnerships with CISA, with Democracy Works and others.
Yeah, so one of the core partnerships I had lifted up was the partnership with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and that is the agency with which we've partnered to provide cybersecurity training to the field. CISA did incredible work at the beginning of the election cycle at the beginning of the pandemic in March to convene a group of folks inside and outside of government to really quickly produce a set of best practices, checklists across a range of operational issues that election officials were going to face this cycle. And that really served as a foundation for us to then build out that robust set of webinars and pull experts in from that process to lift up and share with their peers best practices. But we also, at CTCL, a piece of the work that I emphasized less in this presentation, also worked in really close partnership with a range of different organizations, including folks like the Elections Group and the Center for Civic Design. And in those partnerships, we were able to, as election departments, had core questions, whether it was about Dropbox citing or communications or really any issue, we were able to share a best practices document or connect them with an expert to help them think through how to actually operationalize through whatever the challenge was. So I think one of the most transformational things that happened this cycle is that collaborative work that happened behind the scenes among these organizations that do the work of supporting election officials in the civic engagement field more broadly, and really nurturing that collaboration is another, it's in our organizational DNA, and really look forward to seeing where that can take us.
Great, thank you. And then the last question I want to bring up is one around what is the hypothesis on why Congress wouldn't invest more money into a well-managed election? I think this is something that has, continued to frustrate all of us, and is probably the same challenge that has precipitated the lawsuits against you, which is just this sort of massive partisan divide about whether states and versus federal governments should be funding this kind of thing, and then B, whether funding this at all is the right thing to do. But would be curious if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I really can't speak to why
Congress does anything.
Why Congress, chose. I will say that it's really remarkable to me that we were, in a presidential election cycle and a national public health crisis, and that where we ended up was 10% of what election officials needed. I don't have an explanation for that. I don't think that there is one. But I do think that part of the opportunity moving forward is one, that election officials, I sort of lived in this world this year working directly with local election officials that felt a little bit disconnected from the rest of the world, because election officials across all sorts of partisanship were really well aligned on just being focused on serving voters. And so I was in this my world was not polarized on a day-to-day basis. I was working with Republicans and Democrats and folks all across the political spectrum. And I think that sort of that there's power in that the field of election officials are not divided. They understand that as a whole, to run good elections, it needs to be funded in a different and more sustainable way. And so I think sort of unlocking how election officials can continue to come together and make that case will be one of the really key things moving forward. I will name that, historically, election officials have not been one of the constituencies that's been at the table around policy making, even though they're the ones that are ultimately implementing election law. And that is something that also needs to shift to have, better laws on the books that are easier, better for election officials to implement, but also so that they can be at the table to make the case for the funding that's required to implement those laws effectively.
Great, Tana. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for everything that you did this year. It was just very impressive to observe that from afar. So thank you for taking the time. We're going to now transition over to Danielle Kreis, who is the Associate Professor in the School of Media and Journalism at UNC Chapel Hill, and his colleague, Brigitte Barrett, who is the research lead for the Digital Political Advertising Project, and have done just remarkable work tracking how each of the different platforms manage political ads and the democratic trade-offs that these different policies present. And I think, as we've noted earlier in conversation with Erica and others, how political ads are defined varies widely by platform. How they choose to address political ads varies widely. I think all platforms, for example, have introduced some kind of an advertiser verification process, and there are real pros and cons to that, which I'm hoping you guys will touch on. Some platforms have decided not to carry political ads at all, as was announced by Twitter, and I think it was October of 2019. I think TikTok basically has the same policy, and others, obviously are carrying political ads, but are addressing micro-targeting and so forth differently. I think you guys have thoughtfully noted over the years how all of this regulation of political ads may have a variety of democratic trade-offs, and B, can be shifting campaign activity from the regulated political advertising space, or at least the somewhat regulated political advertising space, to more organic content, which is, of course, itself less transparent. So yeah, would love to hear your observations on all of this, including what you saw this year.
And all in 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Yes, but no pressure. It'll be.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. I just want to say that we put in the chat a link to the website where we host all the various research projects that we've done, looking at things like differences in political ads and definitions on platforms, looking at speech policies, et cetera. What we wanted to do today, though, is something a little bit different, which is think about a little bit more conceptually the link between platforms, their speech policies, and democratic outcomes, particularly at a moment when I think there's growing concern that there is an erosion in things like democratic norms, there's an increase in things like political polarization, and more broadly, declines in sort of seeing the opposition as legitimate. So over the last year, again, we've conducted a range of different empirical projects that looked at things like changing platform policies on things around political advertising, micro-targeting, health, political, and election-related speech. But here we want to think about what is platforms' relationship to what scholars call democratic decay. And that refers to a context where there's an erosion of democratic institutions, democratic structures, democratic norms, and ultimately democratic governance. And we think this is particularly important at this moment because we need to figure out what should platforms be solving for when they create new policies around things like advertising. And also as a research community, we need to know what questions to ask. And certainly for the public, they need to know, how does what platforms are doing relate to their ability to cast the vote in a free and fair election? So What I just want to outline a little bit before turning things over to Bridget are some of the key concerns in the literature about scholars who study transitions from democracies to hybrid regimes, or more broadly, scholars who study the deterioration of things like core democratic processes, institutions, and governance mechanisms. We're also going to run without slides here, I should say. We kind of made the decision that we're going to try to be just a little bit different and talk through some of the arguments that we make, summarizing sort of a number of different research streams. So let me just start out by saying that we actually don't have a really good set of answers to the questions of what platforms should be responsible for when it comes to democratic erosion. In a lot of research that looks at things like transitions from democracy, often media is not expressly studied, or people see the media often as a target of things like authoritarian regimes. And there's very little on platforms, in part because they're so new when we think about transitions from democracy. Meanwhile, research on platforms itself, I think generally has focused a lot on things like polarization and disinformation, which we view as being very important. I'll say more about that later on, but hasn't said necessarily as much about how platforms can be used, especially by political elites and political actors, in order to undermine democratic functioning and democratic norms. And more broadly, one of the things that the scholars around things like democratic decay are really interested in and concerned about are things like the functioning of political parties and the functionings of things like laws. And once those things start to erode a little bit, then we get into the areas of concern for scholars. So let me just say a few things about what we think platforms should be held responsible for, and also shouldn't be held responsible for. I'll start with the shouldn't. In general, if you look at the research literature that looks at the erosion of democratic functioning, we see a few cluster of things that we don't really think platforms have a direct relationship on. This includes what legal scholars call constitutional rot, as well as the erosion broadly in things like norms, as well as the administrative state. In general, scholars who study things like weakening democracy tend to focus on the relationship of political elites to a lot of these functioning, whether this is the degradation of things like constitutional norms, whether it's institutional forbearance by political elites, whether it's the weakening of things like norms around electoral fairness and partisan cooperation. I think we're seeing that in a really big way currently with the lawsuit by the state of Texas, by the failure of a number of Republican leaders across the country to recognize Joe Biden as the legitimate president-elect. These are key and compelling threats to democracy that scholars who study this would be really concerned about. Platforms, however, aren't really responsible for this bigger sort of framework of things that might be weakening US democracy. However, they do have indirect responsibility for a few key things. And I'm going to lay them out here, and then Bridget's going to talk a little bit about some of the examples or cases from 2020 that we revealed in the course of our research. First of all, platforms have an indirect responsibility for the erosion of tolerance. Political tolerance among rivals with competing interests and different religions, social identities, and values is absolutely crucial and necessary in a pluralistic democratic system, especially in the context of securing a commitment to things like free and fair elections. Relating to that, platforms also play an indirect role in efforts to undermine the legitimacy of the opposition. A cornerstone of elections, as well as the ethics of partisanship, is a commitment to playing the electoral game in the future, and that means the possibility of losing now and not facing another side that's an existential threat. Also, platforms likely play an indirect role in growing polarization. By this, we mean that us versus them animosity that animates a lot of politics and broadly sort of creates those fault lines where people are less likely to socialize with members of the opposite party, to view them as a threat. How and when social media and digital platforms do these things is the subject of a lot of research, interest, and debate. But one set of key answers is that platforms may be responsible for doing things like amplifying content through algorithms that divide people. They might be prioritizing content that's the most emotional and the most engaging in ways that erodes things like mutual tolerance and mutual faith. Platforms also give political elites and other organizations a means to do these things. So when Kelly mentioned earlier how political ad bans, for instance, might benefit those with greater organic reach, one thing that we often heard through a set of projects we did around ethics with political practitioners is all the ways in which Donald Trump doesn't often need political advertisements on sites such as Twitter, but Joe Biden might in order to correct misinformation that comes from the president. In general, it's about the rules of the game and who they're favoring. Another thing that we should say is that platforms have an indirect role potentially in decreased public faith in institutions and democracy. And here, this is where the disinformation and misinformation really comes in. We see broadly this move towards what scholars call defactualization, this idea that the public can't trust in anything, in particular, can't trust in institutions that are tasked with producing things like public facts, such as journalists, federal agencies, scientific organizations, and research industries. There's also broadly what we would say is an indirect decline in democratic accountability. Broadly, this is the ways that platforms enable things like strategic actors to undermine sources of accountability, particularly among the public, over elected leaders. I think one thing we're seeing really a lot now, and again, I hope we get into this in the Q&A, the rise of things like Newsmax, for instance, and the One America News Network, that in essence are being a mouthpiece for a lot of the president's claims that there was electoral fraud and therefore Joe Biden is illegitimate. It's impossible to imagine these sites existing and certainly having the distribution and scale that they do without imagining the infrastructure that platforms provide in terms of giving them reach, in terms of giving them amplification. With that, I'll turn this over to Bridget and she could talk through a couple of specific cases and how they relate to those democratic concerns.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, so as Daniel laid out, we do think that while social media platforms are in no way solely or primarily responsible for issues of democratic decay, we do think that they play an important role. And so what I'm going to do now is talk through some of the big policy changes that social media platforms have made recently, and broadly, how we think these changes address their role in democratic backsliding or not. So the three examples that I'm going to very quickly run through are the election delegitimization policies, the COVID misinformation policies, and the political ad bans. So to start with election delegitimization policies, just for background, before the 2020 election, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they had rules about no misinformation about the time, place, and manner of voting. So very strictly no lying about what day the election is on, kind of thing. But going into the election, they expanded those policies and their role in providing election information. They did it primarily by giving really easy ways to find accurate information, putting context and labels around false and misleading content. But also, they created new rules that disallowed the delegitimization of the election process. We saw this as a pro-democracy move that really acknowledged their role in this space. Not adequately enforced, sometimes made very late in the game, sometimes made with an incredibly narrow scope, in no way perfect, but acknowledging their role in protecting democratic processes. And the second major policy change that I want to talk about is the COVID misinformation policies. Now, I know that COVID feels really far afield from democratic backsliding, but as the literature highlights, democracies suffer when trust in institutions suffer, and that includes public health institutions. So again, platforms took their role a lot more seriously around COVID misinformation. However, the execution was so problematic that it debatably made things worse in some cases. So by allowing things like the pandemic video to be posted, get viewed millions of times before being taken down and only taken pieces of it down, it's possible that platforms helped or heightened distrust in themselves and the media by poor and public institutions through poor execution. And finally, very quickly, political ad bans. So Twitter banned most types of political advertising at large, and Facebook and Google both instituted bans directly after the election. Google's was actually lifted today, so we're going to start to see new ads come out now. And that's a policy update that, by striving to remain neutral, solved for very few problems. rather than directly and honestly addressing the problematic content of political ads that Laura has shown, like false information or divisive content, ad bans simply remove the tool that can be used for both pro and anti-democratic purposes. And so we don't see that type of policy as actually solving the problem at hand. And just very quickly, we do think this framework is important for productively directing critiques of social media platforms. As we've argued here, the effects of polarizing content or disinformation, these are more than electoral outcomes. This isn't a partisan issue in the typical sense, but a democratic issue. Thank you, and apologies for going over.
Great, thank you both so much. And so an immediate question, and then if others want to sort of insert questions into the Q&A, please feel free to do so. What do you see as the main solutions here? And I have appreciated, your comments, and many of us have been talking about, okay, there's political ads, which are a little bit more easily governed because they are paid for. There's organic content, which of course is harder to govern given how we tend to hold our free speech values, particularly in the United States context. You have talked a lot, and I've appreciated hearing your thoughts on the trade-offs between, banning political ads entirely, which, gets rid of misinformation, but also gets rid of quality information and may have a demobilization, or at least isn't helping to mobilize voters. If you were in the platform's position, given the challenges that you've articulated around the erosion of tolerance, the polarization, I think many of your papers have discussed the real values trade-offs at play here. Where would you land?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I would say is I think one big concern is that a lot of the things that we identify are political problems that platforms are downstream from. But I guess I would start by saying, Kelly, to your question, is that it helps to be very clear-eyed about what people are solving for. And also to very clearly sort of think about all the different consequences of this. So for instance, I think as you rightly point out, like one thing that we've often heard from like Democratic campaigners, for instance, was the fact that, Joe Biden and other Democratic candidates often want to run ads to promote legitimate news stories to counter disinformation. And that, buying ads in that sense is an important way that they're actually able to correct things that are wrong. So, blanket ad bans and the like sort of take away a really important tool. I guess I would always err on the side of, first of all, I think to some of what Laura said earlier, transparency and disclosure and making sure we have robust mechanisms around that. Clearly definitions of ads themselves. I would say that, I think to Laura's point earlier, broader definitions helps us understand more of what's in the political sphere more generally. And then I think what I would say beyond that is to carve out very clear rules and clear enforcement of those rules to a lot of the speakers today that deal with especially existential threats to democracy as well as health. So, I think one of the challenges that Bridget touched on is that in the last year, we had how many different reversals of Facebook's policy about how they're going to treat, election-related information. And even within that, they had a lot of flexibility, shall we say, in how they interpreted those policies and who was the subject of enforcement from them. I think clearly defined rules that are deeply targeted at existential democratic threats enforced very clearly and fairly absolutely should be the way to go.
Yeah, I remember this conversation years ago with Ann Ravel when she was chair of the Federal Elections Commission and first started sort of waving the flag of we need to regulate these social media platforms. And it was remarkable. I hope you guys, if you have a moment, can put in the chat box the paper. I can't remember when you had published it, but that really analyzed political ad governance practices across Facebook, Google, Twitter. I think you also included Reddit and Snapchat that just really underscored the huge amount of variation in practices, how quickly they change. And I think also just how painful it is to try and even untangle them. And I know that we're going to turn in a moment to Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta and what part of the project that they were running at the center this year basically was having to tracking, doing similar moves to sort of track election related policies overall, not just political ads. And we're pulling things from, tweets and, blog posts. And there just really isn't, not only is there not actual centralized regulation of these platforms when it comes to political ads, but there's just not even a centralized repository for all of their own policies, much less tracking across the different platforms. So I think that paper of yours was a huge asset to the field. With that, I appreciate we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to transition now to our last group of speakers before we move to a panel with leaders from the tech platforms themselves. We're going to hear now from Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta. They together lead the Internet Observatory here at the Cyber Policy Center, and this summer launched the Election Integrity Partnership in collaboration with Graphica, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab, and the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public, where they were really focusing on surfacing and responding to election-related disinformation. And this was a fascinating project with a war room that was running around the clock that did just a tremendous amount of work examining trends and content, which were really different than what we saw in 2016. The actors behind that content, again, very different as I understand it, much less in the foreign adversary realm and much more from domestic influencers, legitimate, not fake accounts, and a lot of new techniques, paying local influencers and things of that nature. And then, as I was just saying at the end of Daniel and Bridget's remarks, they did a tremendous amount of work just trying to track platform policies across time and across, I think, Nextdoor, TikTok, Twitch, and a whole range of others. So would love to turn to you guys to hear about what you learned and plans going forward. And Alex, I'm dismayed to not see your holiday sweater from last night's party, but this is nice.
This felt like a slightly less joyous occasion. So no ugly Christmas sweaters today. I appreciate that though. Cool. Okay, great. So we have a quick deck, covering a lot of the same things that were discussed today. But what we would like to do is give a quick overview of the EIP, of what we did. And then Renee is going to jump in with her discussion of what happened of interest and what kind of our initial findings are. This is all a preview. We are working with our partners here to be doing a bunch of work on these issues and to be writing up a very long report on our findings. As Kelly said, this partnership was a coalition of 4 different institutions: ourselves, University of Washington Center for Informed Public, Graphica, and DFR Lab. It came out of work that some of our students were very lucky to go work at DHS CISA this year on election security. And one of the things they found was that while there was a lot of great work happening on kind of the core cybersecurity issues for which CISA had very clear capabilities and authorizations for, what was less effective kind of coordination on the government side was around disinformation. We could have an entire seminar on what the kind of authorization and legal and structural issues are here. But effectively, this is the kind of stuff that can't happen out of the government side, and that there's going to have to be some work done in the public and private sector, the nonprofit and the private sector, to be working on election disinformation. And so we pulled together these 4 different institutions. Overall, we had about 120 people work on this project. We created relationships via the elections infrastructure, ISAC, a variety of different organizations that pull that together, civil society groups that could report issues to us. We plugged into a number of different media outlets and were able to both exchange information and then also help them know what kind of counter messaging they should do. And then we plugged directly into a bunch of platforms to allow us to refer any disinformation events to them in real time for them to action under their existing policies. We don't have to go into too much detail, but effectively kind of our goal here was to operationalize the kind of research that these 4 institutions did. The steady state going into the election was that 6 months after the election, all 4 of those institutions were going to write 4 different reports of all the horrible things that happened without having a lot of real great impact in real time. And our goal was to have real-time impact. Our goal was to operationalize our research, to have that impact, and then also to gather up data in real time that we could then analyze later, since one of the effects of moderation on this content is while the content might disappear or be taken down, that also means that it's impossible to study and to provide some kind of democratic transparency of what actually happened. And so we thought important for us to do this stuff in real time. And so we had multiple tiers of people, like Kelly said, in the heat of the moment of right before the election and the weeks after the election, we had staff working 20 hours a day. So we ran 5 4-hour shifts a day of an intake team. We had a second tier analysis team, and then a third tier communications team that pulled this all together. Overall, we had over 1,000 tickets. A ticket in our system would be kind of a theme, right? And so one ticket might be about people being handed Sharpies in Arizona, and then for that we'd have thousands or tens of thousands of different pieces of content that we could archive, attach to that ticket, and then refer to the platforms in real time. You don't have to go into too much detail here. This has been discussed a number of times that there has been a shift of the policies for the platforms over time. Kind of the traditional way we've thought about disinformation affecting elections is people lying about how do you vote, trying to discourage people from voting, asking people to commit fraud. The fourth category is something we focused a lot on and was kind of the big winner here from a quantitative perspective is the delegitimization of election results. And that was actually what was the majority of the stuff we saw. As well as the source of probably the most impactful disinformation was around the delegitimization of the results. When we started this project in August, we started with kind of a detailed dive into the policies of a number of different platforms. And as we updated this deep dive 8 times before the election, we both expanded the different ways we were measuring these policies. And then we also saw these companies change. And again, we could talk about this for a long time. I think something that we learned through this is that there's way too much kind of non-specific, fuzzy, hand-wavy criticism of company policies, and it's actually much more effective to come up with very specific scenarios that are realistic scenarios to test the policies against those scenarios, and then to provide both a comparison and public transparency around which companies are doing what. And I think that's actually a much more effective form of discourse here. While I'm sure some of these companies were going to be making these changes anyway, I know in some cases they explicitly asked us about the changes that they should make. So we did have some real impact here between August and November in measuring these things and being very specific and very crisp about the kinds of changes we'd like to see. Instead of just saying their policies are useless or the policies are not effective, that we were very specific about this is the kind of scenario that we expect and that we expect to be impactful. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Renee, and she's going to talk about the kinds of things that we found.
Hey there, it's telling me that my video is muted because the host has stopped it. So I'll just talk without you being able to see me, and that's fine. So EIP tracked, and there we go. Okay, now I'm getting a pop-up here. Okay, thank you. So now I'm getting a, all right. So EIP tracked and assessed narratives, tactics, and policies. So as Alex mentioned, we kind of gave the overview of the organization, so we can go to the next slide. There we go. So this is just an example. So what we would do is we would look at and understand big incidents. So incidents that were beginning to take off, incidents that were woven into larger narratives, and then the tactical process by which that dissemination was happening. We would look at adoption. We would look at whether things were beginning to go viral, what velocity they were traveling at. So trying to understand not only the content and the substance, but the mechanics by which it was spreading as well. Next slide. So, roughly speaking, as Alex mentioned, we had certain types of big themes. So as we've been going through our summary statistics from all of the tickets, what we really saw was it's a little bit cut off for me down at the bottom there, perhaps because it's not full screen, but that big spike is, of course, election day. And so we started to see narratives around ballot counting, which had been, of course, low chatter, really beginning to spike on election day. Things like vote by mail were consistently high. That's the purple line there. So while some things waxed and waned, there were other things like the constant emphasis on the illegitimacy of vote by mail, the purported illegitimacy of vote by mail, that continued throughout. Next slide. So we worked to ensure that we understood all of the major narratives that emerged. Some of them we watched emerge. So some of them our proactive detection and our monitoring teams found before they even reached their first 1,000 followers. Others, we wanted to make sure that we could understand how that, how something had happened, how a narrative had emerged. And so as our tier 1 analysts worked nightly shifts, or some daily and nightly shifts, we would be able to see what was emerging, what incidents were likely to fit into other narratives that we had seen, and ways in which these things would be interrelated. Incidents that emerged several months prior to Election Day were picked up and repurposed again on Election Day and in the days after. So it's important to understand that one of the valuable things about our ticketing system was that we could look back and say, right, that Sonoma ballot story, we first heard about that a couple months ago. Here it is again in this other context, as an influencer puts it out as, here's even more proof. Remember back when that thing happened in Sonoma. So we had the ability to track the growth and the incorporation of incidents into narratives over time. Next slide. So one of the posts that we wrote was look at what was going to happen on Election Day and then post-Election Day. So we really tried to bucket according to timeframes as well, recognizing that while there was going to be a spike of misinformation on Election Day, it would likely change tone and tenor a little bit. So we wrote a post really detailing what was going to happen on there, particularly as mail-in ballots were counted. Unfortunately, most of the things that we alluded to in this post, even though we could predict them, they were largely unpreventable. So sure enough, the legal complaints and affidavits tied to things like wild conspiracies, but also allegations of voter fraud from missing and found ballots, all of that did in fact happen. Assembling evidence to fit the narratives was what I was describing, where past incidents were picked up again. And even though, occasionally there was like a micro narrative around the incident that would then be fed into a meta narrative, trying to use it to discredit the election overall. Next slide. So here's again an example of that slide that I had showed before. Shocking, 1,000+ mail-in ballots found in a dumpster in Sonoma. That was referenced again. These sort of decentralized one-off incidents in the 8 weeks prior to Election Day were referenced again, particularly as mail-in ballots did trend blue, as election experts predicted. And then ways in which the storylines converged. And so one of the things that we're doing now is assembling these into case studies to walk through how that happened with ballot fraud. But next slide. It also happened with regard to election machines as well. The misinformation largely focused on big themes, but we did drill down and try to understand its prevalence by state. Particularly for swing states, and Pennsylvania and Michigan were two that were particularly prevalent. Arizona really picked up on Election Day, but so much of the overall aggregate attention over the 8 weeks leading into Election Day was really focused on Pennsylvania and Michigan. One of the things that we saw as polls closed was that narratives related that kind of appeared in one state would sort of follow the closing of the polls. So allegations about Sharpie markers, for example, initially appeared in Chicago and then moved into Arizona and then moved into California. And so we started to see misinformation narratives that were, slightly inflected for a particular state, re-inflected as those states had their polls closed and people began to talk about the legitimacy of their results. Next slide. So this is an example of states, as we described, the misinformation related to Philadelphia largely took the form of these allegations about voter fraud in the form of ballots. We were able, so this Philly GOP account was very interesting. It was one of the sort of new accounts that really got big on Election Day as it began to post allegations about ballot counting in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular. What we would see was that content from that Philly GOP account would pop up on Parler almost instantaneously after they tweeted it. It would show up on another site, providing the sort of robust cross-platform hopping. Next slide. Another example of a narrative that, as you can see with our kind of graph over time here, the idea of dead voters, it began, it was very small on Election Day, but gradually as influencers began to talk about it, it began to spread again from state to state, and then it began to spread into non-English language spaces as well. And the claim about dead voters was actually one of the ones that was really then picked up and amplified by state media too, generating subsequent press coverage. So you could see these spikes in narratives. They would start small, and then oftentimes there would be one key influencer who would really have the power to make it go viral. Next slide. I think we can skip this one. I think I kind of alluded to it already. Yeah. Overall, one of the key aims of the meta-narratives was to delegitimize the results. So whether they were pulling from legitimate isolated incidents that happened and trying to pull that into a cohesive story, that happened some of the time. The other thing that happened though was the wild conspiratorial claims, like the idea that the US was the target of a color revolution. The idea that outside forces sometimes, or Democrats other times, were part of a vast conspiracy to steal the election was introduced back in August, really amplified and appeared on Tucker Carlson in September, continued to spread in October, and then has continued to be a thing for people to point back to with each new protest movement or allegation of fraud is then tied back into, see, this is the color revolution that they were telling us about. And so again, even when there were no incidents to point back to, there were frames and narrative structures to point back to. Next slide. One of the things that we were particularly prioritizing was the ability to understand inflection points as things hopped around two big influencers. So Stop the Steal started small as a very bottom-up hashtag used by people, many of them in Arizona, as they were concerned about Sharpiegate. They began to chant Stop the Steal outside of the Maricopa County ballot counting facility. And what we really started to see there was this idea that, that the election had been stolen, making its way offline into protest movements, but also really amplified repeatedly by blue check influencers over time. And as a lot of people trust the blue check influencers they're following, this is a way in which there is like a belief in this claim. Next slide. This is just a kind of a further closer look at some of the dynamics around Stop the Steal. This is one that we've continued to track. It's gotten tens of thousands of posts on Parler and tens of thousands of tweets. And even as the platforms began to try to take action on it, because a lot of the content within it was false or misleading, it continued to spread and to percolate across platforms. Next. This was an example of how EIP tried to message those, to try to communicate to the public about those narratives. So we would do these tweet threads to walk through what had happened. And so our Twitter account kind of was a tool for us to put, in conjunction with rapid response blog posts, this was a way for us to help communicate to the public what was happening in as close to real time as possible. So as far as tactics and dynamics, misinformation appeared on all platforms. Influencers drove significant amounts of it, and hyperpartisan media did as well. Oftentimes, influencers and hyperpartisan media are difficult to separate, which is an interesting dynamic of the information ecosystem of today. But another thing that's really important to understand is the extent to which it's participatory. So all of the people who are following these influencers and hyperpartisan media really feel themselves to be part of a digital army, and really believe that through the act of retweeting and liking and sharing, they are actively participating in kind of defending the election from theft. That means that there's real demand for this content, and even as platforms moderate, as other folks who've presented have described, moderating the supply doesn't reduce the demand. And that's one of the reasons why, as the platforms began to crack down on things like Stop the Steal, they began to pop up on Parlay and others. One of the things that we'll walk through in our report are different tactics by which this happened. I know we're short on time and want to do some questions, so we can kind of move through this one quickly. A lot of the, it's hard to falsify claims like "my friend told me." And so that was a dynamic that we saw time and time again. We also saw a lot of what we would call sort of repeat offenders, where they appeared in multiple tickets, numerous tickets, in fact. And the challenge became, what is the role of the platform when an individual account has been involved in 8 kind of blatant instances of misleading information that have either gotten taken down, labeled, or actioned against, but they continue to retain their account and they continue to spread the content. And so there's a little bit of a question there around what kind of friction or treatment is required when there are these repeat offenders. Live streams was a new and very significant type of misinformation, like a conduit for misinformation. Oftentimes it's easier to moderate text. It's easier for researchers to see text, but misinformation that appears in the form of a live stream, particularly on a site like YouTube, has an interesting challenge in that it's very hard to moderate granularly. So, are you going to take down the entire 2.5-hour broadcast because of some misinformation that appeared 20 minutes in? There's no real-time transcript, so you're not really going to see it until, we anyway are not really going to see it until after the fact. And then oftentimes, one of the common formats of live streaming is actually to discuss content that's already being, content that's being shared by other people. So it becomes almost like a meta misinformation, if you will, where Steven Crowder, for example, is discussing the conspiracy about Sharpie ballots in Arizona. So even as Sharpie ballots in Arizona is being labeled on all of the instances of that distinct claim, Crowder's live stream discussing it, of course, does not get a label. And there's some real, dicey questions around what do you do about that? What is the appropriate policy response to the sort of second order discussion of the claims? You don't want to stifle the expression of talking about it, but is there a line in which that continued amplification presents a policy challenge? Next. And then again, tactics over time, I think, let's just, thanks, Alex. Foreign influence, I would say the key takeaways here are that Russian and Chinese networks did use some residual assets to do covert things, but they really didn't get a lot of lift. There was minimal reach, no impact there. Russian state media did its usual thing. It had roughly out there live streaming protests, wrote articles painting democracy itself as, unmitigated chaos and, America was collapsing, things were burning, that kind of narrative. And then there were also the sort of pro-Trump programs on RT that, continue to have these sort of like almost like live podcasts, live streams that discuss these things. And then I'll do this one final slide. Okay, I was just going to say the last piece was Iran. And that was the one area where we did see what we could plausibly call foreign interference in the form of Iran pretending to be the Proud Boys, sending out emails to compromised email lists that had been found on the dark web, alleging that, threatening voters.
Sorry, I thought as the host, Stanford being the host, we have to be the ones that actually follow the time
I
recommendations.
completely understand, yeah.
Yes, but I want to save at least 5 minutes. So we're just going to cut our break a little bit short because this was fascinating. We have a whole bunch of questions. I really wanted to get into your guys' grading of the social media platforms, but given that we're about to talk to them right now, I won't put you in that position just yet. But maybe we can get to that in the Q&A at 12:30. But 4 questions I want to try and raise in the next 5 minutes, if we can pull it off. 2 related to really understanding the problem a little bit better, and then 2 rather that are more on the solutions side that have come from the audience here. So on the problem side of things, how much of this did you get the impression was centrally organized? You were talking about things popping up on, have we decided it's Parler or Parlay? I haven't quite landed on this one, but popping up in multiple places very quickly. So there's a question about how much was centrally organized. And then there was a question from much earlier in the day that I've been saving just for the 2 of you, which was around new platforms, concerns that you're observing there, and even gaming platforms. Someone had mentioned, I think, Animal Crossing or things like this. So those on the problems, and then I'll get to the solutions one in a second.
On the sort of secondary new platforms, and we say Parler now, there's going to be a lot of short-term activity because particularly as the platforms have cracked down on some of the more communities in which certain members were a little bit more prone to violent rhetoric around Stop the Steal and things like that, those users did kind of migrate over to Parler. That's, of course, an active strategy, claiming that one is censored and that in order to find out the truth and follow this influencer, you have to be on Parler, is a marketing tactic for Parler. However, that said, we are kind of looking forward to 2 months out when we'll have some more visibility into to what extent those platforms stay active. Right now, they are a place very much an echo chamber in which the President Trump has been reelected, and there's been a vast conspiracy to steal the election from him. And so, if you go and open the app and follow some of the folks in there, that's what you're going to see. And that's a little bit of a, I think one of the real challenges for us is understanding to what extent that has impact. If those folks then take that belief and either withdraw from the democratic process or potentially behave in a radicalized way against the new administration.
Great. Thanks, Renee. And then some questions on the solution side. I think it was really helpful to see what sort of content was trending and who was behind that. And I heard in terms of tactics that we were really seeing many more social influencers, so not fake accounts. But so how do you guys think about the kinds of interventions that might work given the kinds of new tactics that we're seeing? And then there was another question earlier around how the social media platforms seem to have really stepped up in this election cycle in the US. And I know you guys have done a ton of work in Saudi Arabia and Iran and China and elsewhere. What do we think it will take for those policies, if we think they were effective, to be deployed in other contexts?
Yeah, I mean, on the solutions, it starts to get hard here because one, foreign influence is not there were attempts, but there's no evidence that there's any kind of effective foreign influence in this election cycle. And so the policy frameworks around foreign influence are much easier and cleaner to implement than ones around domestic political actors, especially ones that are well known and are like kind of legitimate actors in the political sphere. And so the solutions are going to have to be about, I think, one, having rules that apply to the high-end actors that are more aggressive than less aggressive. I'm not going to give grades for companies, but I think for all the platforms, the biggest problem for them was the people with the largest audiences, for whom I don't think any of the platforms fairly apply the rules to the people on the really high end. And it was only very recently, for example, that YouTube would start, they just way post facto enforcing some of the rules against election disinformation, where they would actually punish people instead of labeling, for example. And that's the kind of thing that is going to have to become the standard in the beginning, is that they're going to have to set fair rules of, if you violate these policies so many times, that you are going to have some kind of punishment. I don't think it's just the death penalty. Like, you have to have a reasonable progression, a ladder here, so that you have a reasonable alignment of goals here. But if you shut them down for 24 hours and then 48 hours and then a week, what you would do is not only motivate these large actors to no longer push disinformation, but you'd also maybe take them out of really intense. If you saw some of the graphs that Renee showed, you could see how 3 or 4 influencers together can make something trend. I'll say the things that aren't going to fix. This isn't an algorithm problem. It wasn't an amplification. It wasn't like an artificial amplification problem. It wasn't a bot problem. And so I think it's time for us to kind of put away some of the things that were said between 2016 and 2020 that were never empirical, that were never evidence-based, and that are just clearly were not issues in this time. It's really, it's not like a fake account problem. So doing a lot of stuff on verification, most of the biggest spreaders have blue check marks already, have very strongly authenticated accounts. And so I think it's going to have to be around those rules, and then a changing of kind of the model of how these companies. If you have 1 million viewers on your YouTube stream, you are no longer just like a normal person who is spreading, who has like a free expression right. YouTube has effectively become like a Time Warner Cable for you, right? Like, there's some of these folks, especially on YouTube, some on Facebook Live, have viewerships that are close to like the daytime viewership of CNN. And so I think the companies are going to have to treat people like that. They're going to have to treat them differently, because there is more of an editorial responsibility if you're giving people the ability to take one stream and to amplify it out to 1 to 2 million people.
Great. Thank you guys both so much. This was fascinating. I hope you're able to stay. We'll have a fuller Q&A at 12:30, and I imagine there'll be more questions to get to then. Right now, we're going to take a 5-minute break, so we'll come back just a couple minutes past 11:30, and then we're going to turn to a conversation with the platform. So Alex, that was a good tee up for that. All right. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started again here. We have a conversation coming up with the platforms themselves. So after hearing from Alex and Renee and others about how different the disinformation problems were in 2020 than what we observed in 2016, I think it will be really interesting to hear about how different the interventions were as well, and the policies that the platforms rolled out as their responses this cycle were really quite different than what we saw in the last presidential election. Both in terms of better coordination amongst the platforms, as I understand it, and with the federal government and state governments, and also in terms of trying to promote higher quality content. And Nate spoke to this a bit at the outset, where all of the platforms were supporting projects around healthier election information. Facebook launched a voter information center, Twitter created an election hub, and YouTube did something similar. And TikTok launched its own in-app guide to the 2020 elections, with all of these featuring information around how to register to vote and linking to official sites. So there was a significant effort to infuse more quality information into the ecosystem. And then at the same time, there were a lot of changes to the content moderation policies. And I think, as Alex touched on a bit, and as we spoke about also with Daniel and Bridget, it was just a ton of work even to track the different policies that each of the platforms were implementing and as they sort of unfolded. I'll highlight a few from each of them. I think Twitter made, to my understanding, really the more substantial changes in beginning to show users large warning labels at the top of their feeds about potentially encountering misinformation online. They also started inhibiting retweets of articles for those who hadn't read them, and getting, many of you may have seen the sort of pop-ups noting that you hadn't read the article. Are you sure you want to share it? And interestingly, not only did they implement those prompts, but they also then measured the impact of them and found that something like 33%, if I read this correctly, of people who received that prompt actually opened the link before sharing it. Facebook also made a number of changes. Quite a while ago, they decided not to require fact checking of political figures, which I think has been discussed as potentially challenging today. They banned ads denigrating mail-in voting, although I think, as Laura Edelson noted earlier, perhaps a little bit late and after quite a bit of damage had been done. They committed to pairing premature claims of victory with information noting that the vote count was still underway. And they also took some pretty significant steps to address political violence and intimidation, I think prohibiting militarized language around poll watching. And as I understand it, late in the cycle, banning QAnon or militias that were using the platform to organize. And then lastly, on the YouTube and Google front, would highlight three things there. I think there was a vow to remove videos that were technically modified in misleading ways, a ban on content related to hacked information related to the elections, labels that were added to election-related searches, noting that the results might not be finalized. And then, as we discussed a little bit with Laura and Daniel before, a lot of changes around political ads, which Twitter and TikTok both disallow. But Facebook made a number of changes in how they worked with campaigns over the years, allowing users to opt out of political ads. They stopped, I think, after the 2016 elections, paying commissions that were encouraging political ad sales for their employees. They ended their embed program with Facebook campaigns. And then right before the election, I think both Google and Facebook put a ban on new ads going into the after election day that might be tailored to sort of delegitimize the election results. So tons of changes, a lot to discuss. Really happy to be joined today by four of the platform leads: Nathaniel Gleischer, who is the head of cybersecurity policy at Facebook; Clement Wolf, who is the global public policy lead for information integrity at Google; Yoel Roth, who is director of site integrity at Twitter; and Eric Hahn, who is the head of safety at TikTok USA. So it's really nice to see all of you. It's been a little while, and I know just what an incredible amount of effort has gone into this election cycle. It has been really remarkable to see everything that has been done. The way I want to do this is I have 3 or 4 questions for you all, and want to just start with one and then go around to each of you and get 2 or 3 minutes of response. We're going to try and keep them relatively tight. And then once we get through each of your responses to these 3 or 4 questions, we're going to go ahead and open it up to Q&A. So maybe with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. And the first question, I did my best to summarize the different threads that I have been tracking this election season, but wanted to hear from each of you, the 2 or 3 specific policy changes that you made that you think were most impactful this year, by which, and particularly if you actually have data. I know this has been a question, for years. I think back even when fact checking was first sort of rolled out through the platforms of what do we know about the impact that these interventions actually had. Maybe Nathaniel, I'll just start with you and then go in the order that I introduced each of you. So I'll go Nathaniel, Clem, Yoel, and Eric, if that works.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. And first, just thanks. I'm glad to be here and be part of the discussion. I really appreciated the earlier conversations and hearing Alex and Renee talk through some of what they've seen heading into the election was interesting, particularly because how closely it aligns with some of the things that we've seen and I think our partners in industry have seen. And so the one framing point that I would make is I think the biggest difference between 2016 and 2020, and really it was night and day from what we saw, was that you had defender teams across society that were working closely together to tackle this. You had teams in government, at FBI and DHS, you had teams at the platforms, you had teams in civil society, and it really was a very collaborative effort to find and expose this stuff. And I think that made a huge difference. It's an interesting point that a lot of the conversation this time around focused on domestic deception and authentic actors. And I think those are really important factors for the discussion. I do think it's worth remembering, though, one of the reasons for that, I would argue, is so much work has been put into inauthenticity on these platforms that it is much harder to be a deceptive actor and use fake accounts. And so it's not a static world. We have to recognize that both of these threats exist at the same time. There are domestic actors and foreign actors that are both interested in this. There are people speaking in their authentic voice and people using fake accounts. And we still see both of these around the world. And you have to tackle each of these problems, recognize they're related, but not identical. To your question, Kelly, I think the two most important lessons that we took away from this and the changes we made going into it. The first is, and Alex mentioned this point about not thinking just about one level of enforcement. We've really tried to build a continuum of enforcement. So if you are doing the most aggressive, most deceptive, most violating thing that we see, which is running networks of fake accounts to mislead people, all of that comes down. And then below that, you have a gradation of enforcement. And one of the leads on my team talks about this actually in this really thoughtful way, where he says one of the challenges is, I think we often talk in public debate about this as an enforcement problem, and we forget that there's also a regulatory problem. We have to sort of have both ends. You have to make changes to the environment where the penalties may be less severe, because the people who are doing them are probably not as maliciously intentioned. But over time, by making those changes, you sort of clean up the environment and you make it harder for the bad actors to hide. Really implementing that continuum of enforcement made a big difference for us. And you can see that we have our CIB enforcements that I think everyone tracks. We also began publicly talking about broader inauthentic behavior enforcements, which are more about concealed or manipulated amplification as opposed to manipulated identity. And many of those start with warnings. They start with limiting access or taking other remediary steps that aren't removal until these actors sort of get more and more problematic. And then the second thing is recognizing that influence operations or deception are most effective in times of uncertainty. This connects to what Nate has been talking about for some time. And the more that can be done to get out accurate information is incredibly important. We focused on that through our Voter Information Center in 2 ways. One is putting labels on claims that were false and problematic, particularly around the election. And the other is getting out ahead of claims and getting accurate information about how the process works out there for the public. One of the key lessons of perception hacking is that one of the best ways to counter these efforts to play on people's fears is to get there first with accurate information. And it was a case where you really did need a partnership, because I think the platforms are in a very good place to amplify these messages, but our voice isn't necessarily the most expert voice on many of these questions. And so we would work with like the Bipartisan Policy Center and other independent research groups to amplify their own assessments so people could see that. You'd asked about statistics. One statistic that is a really interesting piece of context, Kelly, on this about warning labels, because I think people talk a lot about how impactful they are, what impact they have in different circumstances. In the coronavirus context, which is connected here, we saw that over one particular month, when we put warning labels on claims, so we removed a whole bunch of coronavirus content that could lead to physical harm. And then we also labeled potential misinformation that didn't reach that threshold. And we found that when those labels were on, something like 95% of users didn't click past them. They saw the label as an interstitial and didn't look at the underlying content. So I don't think we should think about labeling as a panacea like anything else. It is one tool you can use. It is interesting, though, to see when you put the different tools together, you think about labeling, you think about soft enforcement, you think about harder enforcement, and you think about regulatory sort of changes at the base, you can start to contain this.
Thanks, Nathaniel. That's really helpful. And I am tempted to ask you how you all define real world harm, but I will keep it moving around and maybe that will come up in the Q&A later. Clem, would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, and thank you, Kelly, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a while. It's an important conversation. So not to echo everything Nathaniel just said, I'll get into first what has been a constant, I think, for us at least over the past years and even before 2016, and then what changed. And I think what was a constant is the way that we design our ranking systems across our services, really, so that they are geared towards elevating authoritative information on topics of importance such as health or civics or current events, writ large whenever users express interest in these topics in our services. That's important because it's a very powerful way for us from the get-go to start by empowering users with the kind of information they might need to navigate this election cycle. There's also a lot of changes that took place over the past few years along the lines that Nathaniel mentioned in terms of developing policies around misrepresentation, manipulated media, deceptive practices, countering coordinated influence operations, and there's more to that. But I think since you asked for changes that are specific to this election cycle and things we did and their impact, there are a few I want to call out, and we can discuss further if we have the time. One is even before the election, we started showing to users across Google and YouTube information panels put into how to vote and how to register to vote and where to vote. And those were, of course, we hope helpful for users in terms of navigating the complexities of the COVID election and the changes that it might mean for them in terms of how to exercise their rights. These information panels, just for a metrics perspective, were seen, I think, more than 500 million times across our services. Then, in addition to that, we sent reminders to users about making sure that they know how to register and how to vote across Google Search and Maps, and those were seen, I think, more than 2 billion times. And finally, and more importantly, on the information panel side, after the election, or rather, as at the moment of the closing of the polls on November 3rd, we started showing across Google and YouTube information panels pointing to real-life tracking by the Associated Press of election results that enabled people who were interested in this election to know exactly what the status was in terms of counting the votes. And those are still live today. These information panels have been seen more than 4.5 billion times at this point. So that's on the sort of elevate information that is authoritative side of the house. And then to speak of policies, you mentioned it, and I think it's worth calling out. Another thing that happened at the closing of the polls on election day is that we started enforcing a policy that's designed to address contexts which are particularly volatile and where there's a lot of uncertainty in our ads platforms, and that's a sensitive events policy, which meant that as of the end of day on November 3rd and up until indeed earlier today, it was not possible to run ads on our services that related to the elections, its outcomes, or its candidates. And that's been, I think, as other panelists before have pointed out, debated, and there are good reasons why this is an important conversation to have. But by and large, we felt it was helpful in making sure that we were not inadvertently enabling or amplifying the kind of confusion and the kind of issues that we knew were going to take place after the polls closed. And so to give you a sense of scale here, that meant that more than 5 million ads were paused during that time.
Oh, great. Thank you, Clem, for that. Now, you all would love to move to you at Twitter, where some of the really more surprising moves, I think, came this year and that were, I think, widely lauded by a number of experts in this space, and would love to hear more about how you thought about those and what you saw as the biggest changes.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly, for hosting this discussion, and to the entire team at Stanford for organizing this. When I think about how the 2020 election played out at Twitter and what we were doing differently this time around, one of the biggest things that stands out is thinking about the problem of election security as spanning not just a matter of policies and enforcement, but also really the way the Twitter product works and the way that policy and product have to come together in order to form a cohesive experience. In advance of the election, we did what every platform has to do, which is iterate on our policies. Policies are always going to need to change based on what Clem referred to as the COVID election. They're going to need to keep pace with the times we're living in. But we also had to think about what the experience of enforcing those policies look like. There's been a lot of discussion from folks like Evelyn Dweck and others about the move beyond the leave up takedown binary. And I would say that's been a major source of inspiration for us at Twitter as we think about what it looks like to enforce our rules going forward. And so we worked first on updates to our policies in advance of this election to address some of what we believe would be the most harmful forms of misleading content that could show up on a platform like Twitter in this context. Things like misleading claims about safety and security issues at polling places in light of the pandemic, or claims that try and undermine public confidence in the election. But when we thought about what it would look like to enforce those rules, we wanted to start thinking about ways to introduce additional context for people on the service so that they could understand a little bit more about what they were seeing on the platform and get access to additional credible, authoritative information on the service. We also introduced some additional friction in our product that could help people think critically before they share potentially misleading information on the service. And so you saw us introduce new product features like nudges that appear if a tweet has been labeled as potentially misleading, that direct you to credible information about that when you're liking or retweeting it. We also introduced some changes for tweets where we disabled engagements altogether. We tried a number of different approaches to see which ones would potentially reduce the spread of misleading content. And we saw, as you noted at the start, some pretty significant positive effects from this. We noted that when we had these additional nudges in place, we saw a significant reduction in people sharing content without commentary. So just people clicking the retweet button without commenting on it, without potentially criticizing it. We saw a marked decrease in that across the board. And then, of course, in situations where we disabled engagements altogether for some of the most harmful forms of misleading information, we saw that really act as a circuit breaker on the virality of misleading content, speaking to some of what Alex noted earlier as being the challenge of kind of large influencers with significant audiences sharing misleading information. We also finally introduced pre-bunks as a way to try and get ahead of some of the misleading information we thought would be the most challenging, where instead of waiting for a tweet to share misleading content, we put corrections at the top of people's timelines first, so that as soon as you open the Twitter app, you're seeing information that tells you, you might encounter these types of misleading claims, here's more information about it. And a lot of research has suggested that's an extremely effective way to inoculate people against misleading information before they're ever exposed to it. And so across the board for us, this came together into a strategy of thinking, first, what do our rules need to be and how do they have to adapt? But then second, what does that actually look like in the Twitter product? And we're using our learnings from the more than 300,000 labels that we applied to misleading tweets during this election as a way to inform what the experience of policy and enforcement in our product is going to be going forward.
Great, Yuval, thank you. And it's been really interesting to track how you guys have been monitoring the impact of these different changes. Eric, would love to move to you. I know that in 2016, concerns about disinformation on TikTok were not as prevalent. And then in the last several months, we at the Cyber Policy Center and elsewhere, I think a number of us have been in dialogue with you and your team as you've thought about these issues. Would love to hear the changes that you put in place.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And you know, in 2016, we weren't around, right? So I think we're definitely the new kid on the block, and it's something we speak about internally quite a bit, which is we're a 2-year-old company with a 10-year-old brand, right? So while we are pushing very quickly and in a formalized way to address all these issues in a pace where we are that 2-year company. We understand that there's expectations and pressure from external environments. So for those who are not familiar, right, and haven't used TikTok yet, short form video app, 100 million Americans are on it now, right, where our whole bread and butter is about creative expression, joy, diversity, inclusion. So for folks who have used it, you've probably noticed that most of our community and creators on the product don't typically trend toward political debates or real-time news. So a big challenge for us, not just on the policy side, but on our internal teams, our strategies, how do we evolve with those potential threats that we've seen, say in 2016, with the information that we have available to us, and ensure that TikTok remains that place where authentic content thrives. So for us, part of that challenge was also acknowledging, hey, while this is our first presidential election, it certainly wasn't our team's. So we saw that as an advantage, right? If there's this blank slate, what type of experiences, either from a policy and enforcement level, from our past lives working for various tech and social platforms, what can we do now? So on the policy side, I think that's always the foundational element. But with that acknowledgement of it's not just policy, it's about what proportionate responses can we have to that policy? And what interventions do we put in place, whether it's on the product side, on the enforcement side, on the discovery side, should we put it in place? So for example, on the policy side, misinformation, disinformation, obviously, synthetic media, incitement to violence, COVID-related misinformation, as we started to see pop up, right? In terms of the election, claims of voter fraud, content that misrepresents the date or result of elections. I could go on and on. It behooved me to say too, that we also don't accept paid political ads, right? So a lot of this was a signal towards, we don't want to be a place for this. We value authenticity. How do we stay that way? I think the big lesson and surprise, not so much surprise, but a surprise in the sense of how I've seen it align with other organizations. And I think our colleagues on the panel are a testament to this, is mirroring the not only policy, but what is the right proportionate response to that policy, right? So on the operations and enforcement side, it was really about speed for us. So acknowledging it can't just be trust and safety internally. It had to be a cross-functional, and we call it a mission control center, cross-functional between trust, safety, security, product, engineering, data, et cetera, to have that follow the sun coverage, to cover any and all incidents and escalations. And from there, understanding what the correct enforcement was, right? So as Yoel just mentioned, removing ourselves from this binary of, do we leave it up or do we remove it? So context is a big perspective here, which is we could take it down, we could look for networks, we could remove the account, you could suppress or limit certain information, right? So take examples like QAnon, for example. We took a very early stance against that. So if you look for QAnon on our platform, we will block it and tell you that you can't find anything on it. How does that trickle down to other parts of enforcement mechanisms? That's the name of the game that we had. And then lastly, partnerships was really important to us as well, investing in strategic partnerships, obviously with Stanford EIP, which was very helpful for us, but investing in our own civil society academic groups like our Content Advisory Council, broadening our fact-checking partnerships like with PolitiFact and Lead Stories to help us gauge with our investigators what was going on, as well as organizations that were really dedicated to elections-related issues like the National Association of Secretaries of State, which helped power our app, right? So on the product side too, making sure that our product was pushing authoritative information, coinciding with our enforcement mechanisms, so folks had the right information at their fingertips.
Great, thank you, Eric. And I'd love to now, I think you guys cited a number of policy changes that you made, both to promote healthy information and to try and address misinformation. And I think in part because there were so many policy changes that we observed in this election cycle. And as I noted, I think Alex and Renee and their team were, trying to scrape these policy changes from tweets, from blogs, and so forth. If you were to name just one policy that you think policy change that you think you were most proud of, or you think had the most impact here, would love to do just like a 30-second each lightning round of what that policy was and why you think that was helpful. Recognizing that there were so many different things that you all did, I think that would be really helpful for all of us in understanding, how to think about prioritizing these.
I think the single most important, and yes, that was my cat, the single most important policy change that we made, as you all learned, she regularly joins in these important conversations. The single most important policy change that we made was the launch of our Voter Information Center, and boosting authoritative content. Adding that piece was so incredibly important, both to labeling content and pre-bunking, getting it out in advance. I think there were a lot of technical, there were many, many other changes that I could mention, and I know we will all talk about them in detail, but at a very high level, recognizing the importance of that and building that as part of the strategy was absolutely critical.
Great. And I think as Nate noted earlier, that was now you have set a bar for yourselves that apparently will have to be replicated elsewhere. So, Clem, did you want to get in?
Oh, it won't be very interesting in the sense that I would second that. I do think the point that I mentioned about elevating information is authoritative to users at the moment at which they are looking for insights about the election. Oftentimes our products are used by users who seek to verify or to inform themselves and who are on a journey to do that. Being able to show them that relevant information from sources like state election officials or county officials in real time was really helpful across our services, both in the form of search results, but also dedicated information panels or labels across YouTube. And so that, to me, takes as the most impactful and important thing with it.
Great, thank you. Yoel?
To be a little bit different, I'm going to say one of the changes that we've made, along with many others in the industry this year, have been rolling out labels on state-controlled media outlets. As Alex and Renee noted, increasingly, as some of the inauthentic activity and fake accounts were much less successful this year than they were in years past, we saw some of the adversaries in this space shift to using state media outlets to try and advance some of their narratives. And I think the absolute most important thing you can possibly do in those situations is provide absolute transparency to people about what it is that they're seeing. It's a change I'm really glad to see roll out across the industry. And it's the kind of transparency and context as a mitigation for mis and disinformation that I think is critically important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate the conversations early on that were, well, how do you think about the BBC and, PBS or, things like that. So, Eric, thoughts on this?
Yeah, it wasn't so much of a change given a relative freshness in the space. It was more around, so within those policies, and it very much aligns with our colleagues here, but what was the underlying foundational first principle that underlined those policies? And one thing that we frequently talked about, and I think most people know this concept now that we're in COVID times, was we talked about R0 a lot, right? So what is patient zero to the spread of potential harmful materials like misinformation? With this acknowledgement very early on is and we talked about this in internal meetings, is hey, we can never cure the flu, but you could probably stop the spread of it through sheer will and grit, right? So a lot of that, and why I bring that up, is it informed, as I mentioned, not only what the policies were, but what were the correct enforcement mechanisms, whether you slow the spread of information through Discover, through our app. And that's also an acknowledgement of our platform. It is very much driven by that For You page, right? So it's not a follow mechanism. It is, this is what you're interested in. And if you have shades of interest that may lead to misinformation, how do we have a target to that to make sure that we are being responsible to block the spread and engagement that may happen?
Great, thank you. Okay,
Hey,
I'm
Kelly.
gonna, did someone, Nathaniel?
Sorry, would it be all right if I made a quick note, just because Yoel and actually Eric and Clem touched on this as well, and there was just a really important point, particularly when Yoel was talking about state media. He mentioned, as it has gotten harder and harder for actors to use concealed networks, they're shifting more to using state media. I think it's just a really good reminder that we have to start from the assumption that the threats in this space are dynamic and that the threat actors are adversarial and they keep evolving. So the things we saw 2 years ago don't look like the things we're seeing today. And so you have to think both about how do you counter the threats that we're seeing today, but also where are they going to move next? And how do you get there ahead of them so that when they get there, you can sort of catch them and contain them there as well?
Yeah, I think this arms race point has been plaguing us for a while. I appreciate how much you guys must be thinking about that. And actually would love to get later to, if you have predictions on where things are going next, would be happy to hear those. So I have one more question I wanted to pose of my own, and then we have about a dozen questions from the audience that I'm going to try and group into 3 or 4 categories. And so I'm really going to try and do a lightning round of sort of 30-second answers from each of you so we can try and get to all of them. I wanted to ask, biggest surprises, biggest challenges the hardest policy decisions that you had to make this year. Would love to hear what really stood out for you.
Should I go first? Are
Sure.
you doing the same? I think the biggest surprise, there was a lot of expectation of focused foreign deception targeting this election. And we took down about a dozen campaigns targeting the US. It was interesting though, how much those campaigns had shifted and how comparatively ineffective they were. And I think that's a testament to the work that everyone here has done. I think that was actually quite surprising. And one of the hard questions, I think one of the really hard challenges we grappled with and others on this call, on this discussion grappled with, was the question of what to do as the early reports were coming out about the laptop potentially linked or supposedly linked to Hunter Biden. And it's a really good reminder. I think there's a lot of work done thinking, how do we deal with these threats? But we have to remember, you very rarely operate in a world of perfect knowledge. When a claim is made, you're not going to know whether it's run by a foreign actor. You're not going to know all the context behind it. You have to act ahead of some of that knowledge, which is why the soft action response and having a continuum of enforcement is so important. Because when certainty is a little bit lower, you may want to take some signaling action, but you may not want to go all the way. And how do you balance that? I think that was a very challenging point, but it was an important one for everyone who was working to protect the election.
Yeah, I think we were all thinking about you guys when the laptop piece came out. Other thoughts on this in any particular order?
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, to start with the obvious, the biggest surprise of this year and certainly a challenge was the COVID-19 pandemic. It goes without saying, but what it did in terms of affecting how our teams were in a situation to do their job and deliver on their plans. We had started preparing for this election a while back, even before the beginning of 2020. None of us had planned, of course, for disruptions in terms of how we would coordinate, of the time people would have available, on the ability to execute when people were becoming caregivers at the same time that they were trying to do their jobs, and of course on the changes it would mean for the structure of the election itself. So that's been a huge, people have really risen to the challenge, and that's a good moment to give a shout out to the many people across Google and YouTube who just really took on a whole different thing than what they were expecting. With that being said, I think that another, if you were speaking of difficult decisions, what stays with me to expand upon Nathaniel's point is the general rise of conspiracy theories this year as a very gnarly issue, an object that we all have to grapple with. It's not specific to the election context. We've seen those arise as well in the COVID context, and certainly it's a growing dynamic. But they are very complex to keep track of in terms of how the narratives evolve. I think Renee and Kate Starbird at the IP have done excellent work in doing just that. But how they move cross-platform, how they adapt, how resilient they can be, and what are the best ways to address them, I think continues to be something we'll need collectively to work on. That's why I really do believe in the value of elevating information source for the invaluable as opposed to just looking at the removals lever, because I really believe context can help. But of course, also whenever it is the case that these conspiracy theories can veer into real-world violence or harm, that's also why we need to have strong policies, and we do, that we can enforce for such cases.
Great, thanks. Other thoughts on this?
I can just briefly jump in by noting, I think one of the challenges we all expected going into this election was the way in which mis and disinformation were going to be broadly distributed issues. It wasn't just going to be social media accounts. It wasn't just going to be something on Twitter. It was going to be a whole of society challenge. And I'll say one of the things I was pleasantly surprised by this time around was the way that collective resilience played out. To give just one example, the narrative of Sharpiegate, which related to the use of Sharpies to complete ballots in Arizona, was one of the early viral conspiracies of this election cycle. And one of the things I was really impressed by was seeing in real time people debunking the conspiracy on social media. So we labeled it and we provided that context in our app. But then I turned on the TV and I saw NBC News running a segment, and they ran it several times, in which they explained exactly what was going on with Sharpiegate. They responded to it calmly, they presented the facts, and they debunked it. And to me, that really underscores that all of us collectively, not just the platforms, but platforms and governments and news sites and journalists and fact checkers and civil society groups and academic researchers all have a part to play in doing the work of combating disinformation. And it was great to see that system in action, since this is novel territory for all of us. But even as I think there were considerable challenges around how we responded to these kinds of disinformation issues, it was interesting to see this play out collectively across all of the different stakeholders in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Yoel. Eric, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I think in addition to the foreign influence capabilities that we had and seeing more of a domestic response, I think what was really surprising to us is seeing our community response. Typically, my experience is that when community members report things, it's not the greatest thing. But I think we saw a lot of really good insights coming from, and you think about our platform as Gen Z, these people just know what QAnon or 3%ers or Oath Keepers or what Fall Cabal is. So that was really interesting of like, hey, this is actually a signal that's really useful for us, not just within our threat and risk intel partners that we're having. So that was a nice, surprising and refreshing thing to see. I think the challenge that we saw and we were prepping for within our scenario planning was the rise of incitement and hateful ideology groups, right? So as I mentioned, 3%ers, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, obviously, as was mentioned in one of the debates, starting to see more of an uprise there in coordination with mass mis and disinformation campaigns. So it kind of went hand in hand. It honestly made things easy for us because there were so many signals and attributes that you climb onto. So it was easier to recall and detect, but unfortunate that we're seeing more and more of that pop up within the social space.
Great, thank you all. So I now have well more than a dozen questions that we're going to try and get to in the next 20 minutes or so. Most of them have to do with policies, what you did, why you did it, whether it worked. A few questions around implementation of those policies, and then some around sort of next steps. Because we are an academic institution and do research, I'm going to start with one that's actually from Nate that is related to research and really trying to get a sense of what you know or what you don't know about what worked. And I come back to that point that Yoel had made at the outset that I saw in some reading somewhere something like a 33% decrease in sharing of unread articles based on the nudge that you guys had implemented. And so to sort of paraphrase Nate's question, we buy the argument that forcing people to click through or to take additional steps to forward things would put brakes on virality. But what do we know about labeling? Does placing a label like this claim about the election fraud is disputed, or Joe Biden is actually the projected winner of the election, next to that content actually change engagement with that content? What do we know about the impact?
Yeah, Kelly, it's a really hard question because I think the state of research on this is evolving extremely rapidly. At the start of this year, the consensus from most researchers studying interventions into misinformation was that putting an aggressive label next to something would have a backfire effect and it would cause people to dig in their heels further on the misleading content. Then around March of this year, we saw a flurry of new research emerge that said, yeah, actually, no, that's not true. Like there is no empirical substantiation for a backfire effect. Make the labels bigger and more overt and make them red and a big exclamation mark next to it. And I think the only solution to this is to gather empirical evidence about what's working and whether people find it useful to them, and then ultimately whether it changes behaviors. I think we're still in the early days of understanding these phenomena. We need to do a lot more research. We need to talk to a lot more people around the world. We need to understand whether they're finding these interventions from platforms valuable, how we can make it more useful to them. And then kind of at a normative level, we need to understand what people expect platforms like Twitter to do. In late 2019, as we were working on our first big misinformation labeling policy on synthetic media, we ran a global survey and did a series of interviews around the world with people on Twitter to ask them, how do you think Twitter should deal with deepfakes? And we heard back, yes, people want us to deal with the most harmful information by removing it, but we actually got a lot of input that said, we don't want you to fact check everything. We don't want you to remove all of this stuff. We want you to surface credible, useful context to us so that we can understand what we're seeing. And that's really informed our approach across the board. We're now hearing a lot of feedback that those kinds of interventions should be more overt. They should do more to stop the spread of misleading content. They should address some of the dynamics of virality of misleading claims. And so there's going to need to be continued iteration around what this looks like. But I think the reality is that we're still in the early days of what this research looks like. We now have a lot more data about what works than we did before the election. And I think you'll see Twitter and the rest of the industry really continue to work on these issues and try and understand what the most effective interventions will be.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to the point of how much research is still needed here, and sort of builds on Nathaniel, yours point of it is an arms race. So we have research now on some things, and then new tactics and techniques emerge, and platforms change their policies, and the need for this research is really ongoing. Other thoughts on what you know, specific data on the effect of labeling?
Just one point to add to Yoel's summary. He mentioned the normative importance of knowing what's expected of platforms. I think one point that's not always discussed is the trade-offs with some of these considerations. For instance, when you go into context and labeling, you can go for precision or you can go for scale. It's hard to have both. If you're going to try to have a very specific label towards any single individual piece of content that has a very specific bit of information, you're not going to be able to deploy that very much, and you're going to likely miss things that might need to be labeled because it's going to be difficult for your teams to see everything. Conversely, if you go with scale and you try to put labels in many different places or to elevate context in many different surfaces, then you will need to have a more general text because you will need to be more agnostic to the specific piece of content. There are pros and cons to both sides of this conversation, and they are very normative in nature. So when we think of what works in this space, we also need to think of what we mean by working. And I think that's an open conversation still.
I think what we mean by working is a decrease in the sharing of in this case, like truly inaccurate election-related content. Eric, Nathaniel, anything you would add to this, or I'd love to move to a question around, since you brought up what is expected, just a sense of what you guys might want to see from the Federal Elections Commission or other regulators here. But Eric, do you have thoughts you want to build on data?
Yeah, I think one thing, and this Yoel said as well, is that we were well aware of like, hey, what does MIT say about the backfire effect? But I think one thing that we started to see was like, what is the context in which you start labeling? And for us, we took a very aggressive stance in terms of if this is elections misinformation, and oftentimes it wasn't a label, we would remove or we would suppress, right? Sometimes it was a combination of limiting the reach of the video or account plus a label. So I think it's multifactorial essentially, right? So how do we start taking a look at when do we put the right enforcements in, whether it's labeling plus limit, whether it's just removing, and then start understanding it from there. And we're here at TikTok, we're planning to do a deep dive into that in late January, I believe, with our teams to kind of discuss what the data and the discoveries look like.
So is it right that basically nobody A/B tested with a random sample of people who you just didn't label it at all, and then another random sample where you did provide a label, and then explored what was the share on that those kinds of studies were not conducted?
For us here at TikTok, as we're evolving our labeling perspective and strategy. So you did see labels in terms of like, hey, this election result may be not called yet. Please go to the AP. You saw, we believe this might be unsubstantiated, pushing to our community guidelines. We did do a couple of A/B tests in terms of how we think about a strategic approach. And very, very soon, probably in the next few months, you'll start seeing more and more communication on our side around not only how we're evolving, but some results that we saw from our elections task force.
Great. And I'd love to, in a little bit move to, what you guys learned from this election and how you imagine that impacting other policies going forward. But before going forward in time, I want to quickly jump backwards in time and ask, this was such a challenging year for all of you, for all of us, but for you guys to first confront the challenge of COVID-related disinformation and have to really rapidly modify your policies to think about how to address that, and then go into the 2020 elections. Were there things that you did under COVID or learned under COVID that were helpful in thinking about how to adjust your policies for the 2020 elections? Or do you see health-related content and political, disinformation as sufficiently different that it would warrant different policies?
I can say quickly, we definitely learned quite a bit from the COVID response. And I think the beginning of the transition to how do we pre-bunk, how do we amplify authentic information, how do we use that as a tool in the tool belt began as we were responding to COVID. So we learned a lot there. And one thing that connects both of these questions, you were asking about the impact of labeling, right? I mentioned earlier, but it's probably worth just pulling it here. We saw that when we labeled pieces of misinformation about COVID, And I'd mentioned misinformation that could cause direct physical harm, we would remove. So for example, misinformation that pushes false cures, or actually now we might be looking at misinformation that's trying to undermine real cures or real vaccines. But if we set that aside, which we remove, then we talk about misinformation that isn't as directly related to physical risk, but could still be problematic. We put labels on that. And we saw over the course of a month with a study we did, 95% of people who saw that label didn't go through it to read the full content, didn't follow on to read whatever was there. And that's one study, it's one piece. It also is about health misinformation, which isn't the same thing as election misinformation. But it does suggest that there are ways that labels can be impactful, can reduce distribution, and are a piece of the puzzle.
And when you say 95% of people didn't read the content, do you know what percent shared it, even having not read it or didn't? And it kind of harkens back to that question around whether in some cases labeling actually increases the sort of like drive-by car accident effect where people, you know, are more engaged rather than less.
Right. So these were actually interstitial labels, and so they didn't click through to view the content. So we don't know, they didn't interact with it at all.
At all. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful to hear. Okay. So many more questions. I want to prioritize out of all of them, the ones that I most want to hear. So I would bucket a couple of questions that had to do with the content versus the actor. And I love Camille Francois earlier this year, like finally put a little acronym around what we have all been talking about for a long time on, you know, you could address the actors, you can address the behaviors or techniques. And, you know, there were comments I think Alex made earlier about that wasn't the problem this year. It wasn't bots and fake accounts and so forth. Or you can address the content and this. So, and there were a couple of comments that came in about the sort of whack-a-mole game of trying to address it at the content level and whether you might address disinformation at the actor level. But then of course you have a challenge that these were actually authentic actors with blue check marks, as Alex noted. And I think Alex had suggested, what if, you know, could you implement a policy of sort of titrated warnings or punishments to bad actors? So we've talked about the content and moderating that. How do you think about the actors?
I can start us off. I think when you look at the dynamics of how misleading information spreads, and this has been the case for a long while, I think you have to contend with a few different communities of people. And you have to do this at the policy level, you have to think about it at the product level, and it matters a great deal at the enforcement level. The first community, and generally I think this is the majority of people who are sharing misleading content, are potentially doing so unwittingly. People say things that are wrong all the time. Human beings make mistakes. And so I think you have to start from a premise of saying, even as there absolutely is intentional falsehoods that are disseminated in these contexts with malicious intent, people are going to make errors. And so you have to start by thinking about proportionality and about just enforcements from a standpoint of saying people will err and they will share things that they believe are true, but which in fact aren't. And I'm not saying that to be Pollyanna-ish, I'm saying it to kind of underscore the need to build a policy approach that can contend with that kind of well-intentioned sharing of incorrect information in the same way that it can contend with a concerted actor who is engaged in a campaign to try and deceive or influence people in a fashion similar to what we've seen from some state-backed disinformation campaigns in years past. And so the difficulty of this space really is that you have to figure out how to modulate your approach on the basis of all of those different factors. One of the things that we've learned is that even as you want to start from a place of thinking about proportionality and justice for people who are unintentionally sharing, there is undoubtedly a component of truly malicious behavior, what definitionally would constitute disinformation, people engaged in the knowing sharing of falsehoods as part of a coordinated effort. And so one of the things that we're starting to think about is how to build out that spectrum of harms that acknowledges all of the different types of behavior and tries to have us enforce our policies in a way that's going to feel proportionate to the specific harms of each of those. That's not a solved space. I think some of Alex's proposals around sort of escalating timeout periods as a way to warn people and be more overt with setting norms in a community is a really good idea. Another thing is just helping educate people and helping them understand more about what the expectations of the community are. bringing down the ban hammer too swiftly can actually have its own backfire effects. And so I think we need to think about that. And collectively, this isn't a solved problem yet, but the space gets more and more complicated when it moves from being fake bots run by a nation state that are specifically spreading falsehoods to real people who might or might not be well-intentioned in their behavior.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this, on the actor question?
So one of the things, so I completely agree with what Yoel's talking about. And in particular, I think it's important to recognize that we can't talk about the misinformation space or the disinformation space as one problem. There's sort of a tendency to do that. And it's interesting, if you look back for quite some time after 2016, it was basically entirely talked about in the context of foreign interference. Increasingly today, we see it almost largely being talked about in the context of domestic interference. And I would push back pretty strongly on that. I think we have to recognize that both of these things happen, and they're happening at the same time, and they're both serious problems, but the techniques you use for them are different. And some of it's about foreign and domestic, and some of it's about authentic and inauthentic. And Camille's ABC framework is extremely useful because it allows you to not just enforce based on actors or content or behavior, but on all three in different ways, and to build a continuum of enforcement. So that if you have an unwitting actor, or maybe if we go back to this idea of uncertainty of information, you just can't quite tell whether they're being intentionally deceptive or not, because the vast majority of people you can't tell. The action you take there should be very different than where you can clearly see from behavior or the history of the actor that they are repeat offenders and that they are being intentionally deceptive. And how do you build that continuum? And then one point that I thought I would bring up, you mentioned the sort of arms race metaphor, and I saw on the Q&A someone used the term whack-a-mole. And I'm cautious of both of those as metaphors here. And the reason is, if you think about whack-a-mole, right, the problem never gets better. You keep doing the same thing. Here, in addition to trying to knock down the moles, we can also change the game. And that's what makes this a situation where we're actually making progress as opposed to just treading water. Public debate occurs across a terrain, and it always has. Different media, newspapers, discussion in different places. Right now, a big chunk of that terrain is the platforms. And over time, we have the ability to change that terrain to make it more conducive to authentic discussion and more resistant to deception. And we've seen that, actually. It's very interesting. If we look at foreign interference and CIB as a place where there's been long-term work, 4 years ago, we have very large networks of fake accounts. Today, the actors are still trying. They've largely moved off the platforms, are using independent websites. And in doing that, they're getting far less reach. They're less effective. They're getting caught earlier. And so it's sort of like whack-a-mole. If you imagine that over time, you can close some of the holes and slow down the moles so they're easier to hit. That terrain change is really critical here. And that's how I think we all are making progress as opposed to just trying to stay ahead of the deluge.
Great, thank you all. So I want to do 3 more quick questions before we open up to a Q&A that will include a number of our prior speakers who are still, who are going to rejoin us in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if you in the audience have particular questions for others who have spoken earlier today, please go ahead and enter those now, and we'll try and get to them in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And I think a number of our colleagues from the platforms will also be able to stay on for this final sort of broader Q&A. We'll probably do about 15 minutes of that before we close. So before getting to that, though, 3 last questions for all of you. Nathaniel, you spoke early on about how there are things that the platforms can do, but there is also just an absence of regulation in this space. And I think we've all had conversations over the years, and you have seen some of the platform leadership come out publicly asking for clear regulations to be put forth, and would be curious to hear each of your thoughts on, 1 or 2 regulatory steps that you think would be most helpful here. Second, we had comments by, I think, both Laura and Bridget earlier on, identifying, a lot of conversation around the policies that you had publicly pronounced, and then questions around how effectively some of those policies were implemented, recognizing just the massive scale of content that you're dealing with. And I think Laura had put up a couple examples of things that were taken down from, one account and then came up in a slightly different format or from a slightly different person and were maybe left up. So a question around implementation challenges, and then one around your own sort of, and I mentioned at the outset that there has been public commentary about your collaborating more effectively and more intentionally this year. And there was a question that came up around GIFT CT, which I think most on this call are probably familiar with, but the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which I think several of you are a part of. And would there be some value in a kind of, is there already a coordinating effort amongst you all that just isn't as publicly transparent? And if not, should there be? So just to quickly reiterate, what kinds of regulations do you think would be helpful? What were the implementation challenges where you had clear policies but may have fell down on implementation? And third, some kind of coordinating infrastructure.
Sure. I have to sadly drop off in a few minutes, so I will take the first stab at this. Apologies for leaving early. First, thank you for the questions. In the regulatory space, I think one of the challenges of passing laws or regulations that would be impactful here is what we were referring to as the whack-a-mole/arms race with the slow moles, or whatever Nathaniel was depicting as an apt image here, because it makes it very hard for governments to think through future-proof approaches. I do think some of the comments I've seen earlier today around more transparency and more clarity on what it is that we are doing on the platform side, how we are enforcing this, why we think what we're doing are the right solutions, would enable a better discussion, if nothing else, on this conversation. So, and I do think we'll see movement in this space around the world in the coming years. So that to me strikes me as a promising venue. There are a lot of questions about how exactly that could and should be done, and lots of legal barriers for it that Nathaniel personally is very familiar with. But still, that's an important venue. The second question was about the difficulty of enforcement. At the risk of repeating myself, I do think that's where the precision versus scale question really comes back. There are some issues that are best dealt with policy enforcement because they require individual reviews and actions. And I do think insofar as that's needed, we are investing a lot in this space. Our trust and safety teams have expanded and have worked all hours throughout the year, but you'll always have misses, even when you try your best, even when we use very sophisticated systems to detect content even before it gets any sort of traction. And that's where really product implementation and ranking systems can achieve the kind of scale that policy enforcement cannot. And so again, coming back to what kind of product design changes can we undertake so that there is more friction and there is more context before users are exposed to potential misinformation, and how can we make it more difficult for malicious actors to exploit our services. And finally, on collaborations, I'm not being involved directly in GIFT CT and less familiar with the framework, but I do think we have made a lot of progress just over the past few years with everyone around this table and some of the other panelists as well, in terms of working better together as an industry, with civil society, with academia, on first of all discussing these challenges, and second, specifically in the context of countering influence operations, really getting better at dealing with the cross-platform nature of the problem and keeping abreast of movements that might be relevant for all of us. So I do think some things certainly is working much better now, and at least as far as I'm concerned, that's a good amount of progress. There's always more room to grow here, but at least I'm personally satisfied with how it's been evolving over the past few years.
Great, thank you, Clem. And I'd love then for the rest of you to take just each of these final questions quickly in turn. Regulations, are there one or two that you think would be especially helpful here?
I'm going to cheat a little bit in the sense of and linking 1 and 3 together, right? And I think one of the big themes that we've talked about within this panel is we don't know enough yet. It's such a nascent space. So how can we even think about what a regulatory environment looks like for something that's relatively new, right? So that's why I've always, and to the point of question 3, how do we work together in a more timely manner for things like GIFT CT or crimes against children? Those are kind of things that we've looked to for other subject matter expertise. Also think about it from an InfoSec perspective, right? So, working with InfoSec teams in the past, when they see a DDoS attack, for example, on a domain, they'll call TLP Red, and then Microsoft, Google, other cloud providers will just get on one call and say, what are we seeing, right? And oftentimes we've talked about that internally too, which is like, what does information sharing look like through all the platforms that we see? Because at TikTok, quite often when we see content that had the potential to go viral were quite ubiquitous. It was a tweet that was being green screened. It was something that you could see very clearly was a screen share from YouTube, right? So if we're seeing it, then how do we share that information back and forth? And for folks here at Stanford and EIP, that was a very illuminating thing to see, as we were all on that Jira thread, right? And all of us were there, and we all started to see those patterns and recognition. So how do we do that and formalize that for the elections and the platform integrity efforts to come? And the second question, in terms of implementation, one thing we used as a North Star was always detect, triage, and prevent. And then to the previous question before this around, well, how do you actually do that when you have a spectrum of harm that includes not only attributes that were relating to content and trends, but different mediums, right? Comments, text, live stream, video, and then thinking about who's actually saying it and start stack ranking that in terms of what is the most harmful and what is the most severe. So I think that's the challenge, which is if you have this North Star, then you need not only moderation and policies, but you need the technology to be flexible enough to catch every part of the spectrum, right? So I think that's something we're working a lot internally with our engineers, our security teams, threat intel fusion type centers to understand how we can put all of that together with that goal in mind.
Yeah, I've heard from each of you today this move towards wanting to sort of tier information in terms of the degree of real world harm that it potentially presents, and then modify or sort of titrate your response based on that. Other last thoughts on regulations, on GIFT-CT, on implementation challenges before we move to a broader Q&A? And if folks do have questions for everyone, please go ahead or for other panelists as well, please go ahead and enter those and I'll start getting to them.
I can just briefly note, so I am on the investigative side of the spectrum of the folks on this panel. I run our team that's actually detecting and disrupting a lot of these threats. So I try and stay out of some of the regulatory stuff, but I'll note that as in a lot of security spaces, protecting the work of security teams to do what they need to do and how they collaborate with their peers at other companies is critically important. When we're dealing with a space like this, there's always going to be trade-offs that people have to make between security and privacy. And a lot of times there can be regulations that are very well intentioned in certain domains that have knock-on consequences in others. And so I think thinking of these challenges holistically is incredibly important to ensure that teams like mine, teams like Nathaniel's, teams like Clem's, teams like Eric's are able to continue to work together to address some of these challenges. And I think it gets to kind of the broader question of what collaboration means in this context. I think GIFT-CT is a particular model of how it works when the tech industry comes together to address a specific issue. In the domain of disinformation and misinformation, I think we have the unique asset of an incredibly robust community of researchers who also study these issues and have arguably brought to the forefront some of the most critical insights that inform all of the work we're doing here. And so I think when we talk about collaboration, we need to figure out a way for that to be participatory in a way that's not just limited to the other panelists here or to the specific tech companies. It's part of why Twitter publishes data, not just that we've taken something down, but the full details of everything we've taken down whenever we disrupt a disinformation campaign. We do that because we want to make sure that researchers can be a part of those discussions. And so when we're thinking of what models for collaboration in this space look like, I think we really need to build it in a way that's going to promote that kind of collaboration, not just within the industry, but as part of a larger community of practice that includes civil society, academia, government, law enforcement, and folks around the world who care a lot about these issues.
Thanks, Yael. I think there have been a number of questions about, are people publishing their findings from what works and what doesn't, and how much are you guys sharing this with each other? And I have seen really varying degrees of transparency and collaboration on that. Nathaniel, any final thoughts before we then open this up to the other panelists?
Sure, I'll try to hit those points. So regulation, I think 3 things that could be particularly useful. I think transparency requirements on platforms about their enforcement actions are really important and valuable, and we should have more of that. For us, we are public about every single one of our CIB enforcements, for example. We announce it, we share information on it, we try to get that out there. I think that that consistency is valuable. So that's one. The second is deterrence on actors. all of us are talking about basically deterrence by denial. We make things harder for these actors. We make their accounts less valuable. We put constraints around them. But at the end of the day, private companies can only do so much in terms of deterrence. If you want more meaningful deterrence, you need a government to step in and impose costs. And then the third point that I think is important is clarity, particularly when we talk about domestic actors. It raises really hard questions about what is the boundary between deceptive behavior and political advocacy in a democracy. If we think about some of the events that came up, there were questions about the campaigns paying people to engage online. There were questions about a protest organized on TikTok among elsewhere involving one of the rallies that the Trump campaign was having about, is this acceptable? Is this not acceptable? The boundary of what is permissible and is not, drawing that line is extremely challenging. And I think it's really important to have the democratically elected legislature helping to do that shaping. So that's a couple of places. The last thing I note about regulation that's really important is I think it's a reminder that this is a global problem. And when we talk about regulation, we're not just talking about the United States. There's been a lot of focus here, and we are focusing on the US election. It's worth noting the Myanmar election happened 5 days after the US election. So my team was sort of working on both of those at the same time, had a whole number of takedowns in the Myanmar context as well. And whether we see regulation or not, it's not necessarily a question of whether the US Congress will act. We have to remember the European Union is already moving in this direction. Singapore has expressed interest in taking some steps in this direction. A number of governments are. So we're going to see frameworks. I think the goal is to see frameworks that are as protective of democratic principles and as supportive of the public debate we're all trying to defend as possible. On the second point, which is implementation, I would just say speed is extremely important. You can have the best rules in the world, but if you can't move quickly in the face of this, you can't get there in time. And some of the biggest challenges we've had is when we didn't move quickly enough. We've done a bunch of things to move faster, and I think there's a lot more to be done there. And then the last on coordination, I was extremely proud and sort of impressed with the coordination we saw around this election. You had a number of companies and government entities meeting weekly to try to share information. A number of our major takedowns were tipped by government partners. So you're seeing that back and forth. One thought for all of us is, I think there's a tendency to push towards more formalization. Let's formalize this further. And that was actually my instinct when I joined. When I joined Facebook, I had left government not that long before. And one of the things I did while I was in government was work on the ISAO and ISAC framework. And so there's sort of an instinct, you should have a more formal structure and here's all the benefits of it. One of the things I learned particularly early on was how hard it can be to get organizations to buy into, commit to, and participate in a formal framework. And so a question that I would say is, formality or informality, my question is, what gets us the best and most robust collaboration to get ahead of this stuff? And let's not let formality get in the way of informal cooperation that's working, but let's use formality when we need to get more engagement.
Great, thank you. This has been really interesting to hear your thoughts, and I know what a crazy year it has been for all of you. I imagine going into 2020, you knew it was going to be crazy with the election and the added complexity of COVID. So I feel for you and your teams. With that, I think we will go ahead and just do a quick, maybe 10 or 15 minutes if the other panelists who are still around want to turn their cameras back on. If there are questions from the audience for any of the panelists that you can still see here, I'm happy to take those and do my best to moderate it, recognizing that it is just insanity to try and moderate questions for this many people. We're going to give it a go. And I think also if Alex and Renee come back on, I'd be very curious to hear some of their questions. Hey, Renee. Their questions for some of the platforms, as well as I know we've had those conversations. So are there any questions that panelists have of one another? And if so, you can just sort of signal to me and raise your hand. Nate, go ahead. And then I'll start looking at the queue from the audience as well.
Can I just pick up where Nathaniel left off, which is, how should we think about the precedent that is set with the US presidential election for other elections around the world? As to, as we sort of said before, you all raised a bar here, and the U.S. elections are themselves unique compared to other elections around the world. This presidential election was unique in the span of presidential elections, right? And Donald Trump is a unique figure historically and cross-nationally. Having said all that, right, you've done certain things that it's now going to be hard for you not to do them in the context of India or wherever else. And so I'd like to get a sense of what you think the precedents are that are, and the pressures that you are feeling already from other countries in thinking about how you are going to intervene in the in regulating the speech environment in those places. Instead of lofting it up, why don't I start with Yoel, go to Nathaniel, and then Eric.
Sure. I mean, we've been saying for years that, you know, we learn from every election around the world, and we take the lessons from each election and bring it to the next. And that's true, and it's informed our strategy in a lot of ways. And now, as you noted, we have a situation in which we tried a lot of really big and ambitious steps in the United States and have to figure out what that's going to look like around the world. One of the things that was the hardest for us was getting local context to allow us to understand whether something that was claimed on platform was actually true or false. You could imagine this as being something like, did this voting machine actually malfunction? If somebody tweets out a video of, you know, they try and push one button and it registers as something else. In the United States, we have a robust press environment. We have robust public dialogue happening about these issues. And we had government stepping into an incredibly critical role with things like with sort of public fact-checking initiatives and really helping people understand what was happening in real time to debunk some of the viral rumors. The question is how that scales in other contexts. And I think you're right that the platforms and the press and everybody have their work cut out for them to figure out how to replicate elements of this in other elections around the world. But I do think we learned a couple of key lessons that are going to inform what we do going forward. One is, as Nathaniel noted, the importance of speed. We have to build solutions that will let us respond to things quickly and that will be a circuit breaker on virality to give us the time that we need. But then second, it's really the importance of those local partnerships, especially when you're talking about elections with complex regulations that differ by state or by locality, or that have different practices that vary from country to country. The European parliamentary elections were like 20 plus elections taking place concurrently. You have to build that kind of local knowledge base that informs your work. And that's going to be a key element of how we try and scale what we've done here in the United States to other elections around the world.
I'll add a couple of things. So it's certainly true that there are elections around the world and that the environment and the challenges you face tend to be quite different. There are some common threads, but the nature of disinformation in the public debate in the United States is very different from the nature of disinformation in the public debate in Myanmar, for example. And so I think one of the things there are a couple of common threads that do connect them. First, local partnerships are absolutely essential. We knew that. I think this has spurred us to see how you can do that collaboration. And we're building that, and we're going to be intentionally looking to build that in other countries. Second is sort of a challenging and hard truth that I think we all should recognize, which is the government is an absolutely essential part of how an election is handled. In a country where the government is the source of the problem, it is incredibly hard for the rest of society, no matter how much they pull together, to really mitigate that challenge. And having worked in countries where you have supposedly democratic elections and you have direct government action against that, we have to recognize that you can only go so far. And I think that's a reality as we look at the challenges we faced around this election and some of the huge benefits. The work of DHS and the CISA team, the work of the FBI were absolutely transformational. And if we hadn't had that, the story would have been very different. And we don't always have that when we're going globally. And the last thing that I would note is, it's funny because I said earlier how important speed is, and I will just note there is a tension with speed, particularly when you're acting globally in situations where you may not have as much local context. The easiest thing to do quickly is to take stuff down. And that is an incredibly problematic outcome when you're talking about public debate and the importance of it in these discussions. So you have to move quickly, but you have to recognize that there's an easy tendency and an easy call sometimes to just remove more. And I think the end result of that and where we all end up from that is actually a pretty scary outcome. And so the question is, how do we learn from this? How do we build on these local relationships? But most importantly, how do we operate in places where we don't have the advantages I think we all have in the public debate in the United States, and we don't have the comfort and the familiarity?
Yeah, and really quickly, I'll add on to that. Our perspective at TikTok has always been, with regards to elections integrity, we always saw it as what we would classify as a global shared service, right? So here's this model that we have, both process, product, tools, incident management, and here's kind of the playbook that we have. To Yoel's point, one of the recognitions for us is there needs to be localized operations, localized understanding of what the regulatory environment is, right? So for me, as I mostly focus on the US, I also need to know what are the possible regulations as well as laws that have to do with time-based content takedowns in Japan and Europe and France, penalty-based content takedowns in Malaysia or Singapore, or other things like government takedown without notice, right? So all of these things are hyper important for when elections happen in the regions, and needs to have that both, here's your services and sandboxes you can play with, whether it's tools, engineering, and product, but also making sure that you have the right boots on the ground to interpret what's actually happening, because I'm not going to be able to determine what's happening in, for example, a place like Brazil, just because I didn't grow up in Brazil. I probably have some insight in terms of what's happening socio-politically, but we have a team in South America informing what we should be doing based on what we oftentimes refer to ourselves as. We're an experiment culture, right? Oftentimes it's US first in a lot of occasions, especially within elections, right? What can we learn, and how do we share recaps and postmortems with the rest of our teams across the globe?
Great, thanks all. Other questions from others on this screen, or I can go to a question that we had from the Q&A. Yeah, please, Laura, go ahead.
So this is more, I think, maybe a question for the poli-sci folks. So I do think that everyone worked incredibly hard and was successful at running a safe election. You know, we've heard about the money and work that went into ensuring that. What I worry about is I'm looking at these surveys that are coming out now that many people think that the election was stolen. So what we weren't successful at is necessarily running a trusted election. And I worry that all the folks who disappeared, this was like a mass effort, right? This wasn't a single coordinated campaign to cast doubt on the integrity of an election. This was something that a lot of individual actors had their own individual motivations to do. And I worry that those incentives, we haven't shown anyone that they maybe shouldn't do this. There's no incentive not to. And so I worry that this might be just the new game for a while. And I wonder what we can do to combat that.
Erica, are you going to, I can just do a quick few thoughts on that. I mean, look, I think this stems from some of what Bridget and I were talking about before, that this is primarily a political problem and not a media problem. I see platforms as downstream of these larger efforts to undermine trust in democracy. What can we do about it? I mean, so we've been part of an effort that have been thinking about media coverage. I think part of it is some of the things that the platforms did pretty well this cycle is keep amplifying trusted information, keep amplifying voices of election administrators, of the nonpartisan people who are responsible for upholding elections. Keep working to amplify trusted voices like legacy journalism that's doing the hard work of verifying facts and information. But ultimately, I mean, I think we're heading to a very dark place in this country, one where there is a systematic attempt to delegitimize the incoming administration. And I think there's limited things we can potentially do about that, except for as platforms, keep reaffirming the democratic role that you all play. I think you play a role of being democratic gatekeepers. I think, preventing politicians from undermining their own accountability at the ballot box is the clearest thing that you can engage in, and then problem solving around that. And I guess the last thing I would say too, to the problem of misinformation, I think as Alex and Renee really pointed out, like if this is a blue checkmark problem, if this is an influencer problem, if this is a political elite problem, if this is a presidential problem like Donald Trump, and there's particular actors who consistently violate prohibitions on things like electoral disinformation, then you should put those accounts on a special watch list or put them on a tape delay. If they're going to be repeat offenders, I do think that there needs to be much more robust enforcement, particularly on political elites, and political science will tell us that what elites do matters most.
Thanks, Daniel. Other thoughts on this, or I'm going to just take a last round of questions. If people raise their hands, if they have any questions they want to pose, and in the absence of that, I have one more from the audience, and then we'll close. But Nate.
Yeah, can I say just one thing? Because I agree completely with what Daniel said, and let me just observe a phenomenon that happened in this election, which we all know about, but we haven't quite, I think, absorbed, which is that the platforms are becoming the policemen of polarization, right? So that they are all media actors are now looking to Facebook and Twitter and Google to a lesser extent to see what their judgments are on the truth of things, right? So they're reporting on them. There's a sense in which they're becoming this news-generating entity where the fact that they've taken action on an item is itself news, right? So it's this competition to prove that something is true or not, and say, haha, look, Twitter has or Facebook have put a filter on this, and that is that is a very different dynamic. Now that, of course, is what's leading to all the charges of political bias that they are confronting, and it's leading to not just polarization and lack of trust in the election, but also lack of trust in how the information ecosystem is being regulated by the platforms.
Great. I'm going to throw out two last questions. One is around from the audience. Is there anything that we can do? And there was a question earlier on as well about what we can learn from traditional media regulation that might be applied to the social media platforms. And that came up, around 8 a.m., 9 a.m. And then there's been another one on the fairness doctrine and whether that would make sense to apply here. I would suggest, my quick sense of that is that, well, I guess for those who aren't familiar, the fairness doctrine was revoked, I believe, in the mid-90s, but had prior to that required that television outlets provided equal coverage in terms of time to different political parties. That was revoked. Many have attributed some of the modern information environment challenges to that revocation. There's been talk about could we apply it to the social media platforms, and the challenge, of course, would be that how do you manage that at the massive scale and sort of fragmentation that we're working with, and it would be super politically fraught, even if it was feasible from an implementation perspective. But are there other thoughts on the fairness doctrine here that I may have missed, having had many conversations about this lately? And I would commend, actually, in the book that Nate helped edit this year, Social Media and Democracy, Frank Fukuyama, and I think it was Andy Grotto had written a great chapter on media regulation in the past across different Western countries and what we could learn from that now. But other thoughts on this one?
The fairness doctrine is a solution to a different problem, is I guess the way I would put it, and it's not, yeah, you can't operationalize it on Facebook or the social media platforms. It might be desirable if you're worried about echo chambers, and if you think that the problem is that people are not exposed to cross-cutting information. But when it comes to disinformation regulation, I don't think that's, the fairness doctrine is not going to stop that.
Great. So then the last question, which I think may be good for Alex and Renee, although maybe some of our colleagues from the platforms as well, is about smaller social media platforms and what we anticipate seeing there. And Renee, you spoke about Parlay earlier. We've heard of a number of others that have come into the mix. Do we anticipate that there is going to be some kind of fragmentation of social media where the sort of more extreme groups are moving into these smaller channels? Or what do you think about the role of smaller platforms right now and the role that they might play in the future?
Part of this is a question of to what extent certain communities continue to feel that they're being treated unfairly by major platforms. That's one of the driving forces that the people who run these platforms, which are businesses, it's important to remember that they're businesses, and they're using them as recruiting for their businesses. They're using that narrative as recruiting for their businesses. Despite the fact that there is no evidence to indicate that there is any sort of real there, the narrative continues to work and people continue to go. But it's not really clear that they stay. And in some cases, one of the interesting dynamics is the question about visibility, right? So if people find their way to these platforms, rather than being on mainstream platforms, the ideas that they're espousing perhaps are reduced in visibility through that deplatforming. They continue to operate in these darker or more remote or harder to find spaces. And then the question we have is, does this continue to grow their movement with new adherents, or does it largely kind of encapsulate it and then it remains the sort of core true believers, but doesn't continue to grow? So the role that those places have played for a while now, you know, Telegram is not new, Gab is not new. Some of the, Vote, the Reddit alternative, not new. They have always remained kind of on the fringes. And I think the question becomes, does Parler go in that direction, or does it continue to, continue to amass an audience that remains engaged after, in this case, we'll have a really interesting visibility into that following the inauguration.
Yeah, I agree with everything Renee said, obviously. I just want to just take a step back. I think one of the things we're seeing in the last month is demonstrating the weakness of the overall discussion about these problems, in that it has very aggressively conflated specific company or platform problems with internet problems. The truth is, the internet means that the marginal cost of amplifying and moving data has gone effectively to zero. The internet means that people will always be able to find one another who did not have the ability to discover one another. And that has positive impacts and it has negative impacts. And there's a bunch of things that people have just assumed are specifically due to specific affordances or business decisions of companies that turns out to be totally wrong. There are folks who aren't represented here who I won't name because they won't be able to respond, but there's folks who've written entire books on very basic theories of what has driven a lot of these problems that are just completely and totally not correct. Because the truth is like a couple of basic changes to the information architecture of our planet means that these are problems that we're going to live with forever. And you can't moderate your way out of them, and you can't just put pressure on specific companies. So we can want the big companies to be more responsible, and we can want them to be more aggressive in some ways, but we also have to, Daniel's totally right about the political problems. We also have to plan our responses to this with the assumption that there will always be certain groups of people that will have the ability to create communities in which none of these rules will ever be applied. And to the extent that these communities are not doing things that are actually illegal, so around child safety or terrorism, there are responses because you can put real world responses in place to people doing this kind of stuff. But for all of kind of political disinformation, kind of extreme points of view that are hate speech, but not to the point of where it's actually illegal incitement. All this kind of stuff is going to continue to exist no matter what the companies represented on this call do. And I think what's happened here is the move to Parler has demonstrated to a number of people that it is extremely hard to run a billion or multi-hundred billion user social network. It's not that hard to run a social network for 10,000 people or 50,000 people, right? And the software and the equipment to do it is just off the shelf. And so I think we're going to see a huge explosion of these smaller communities. And for those of us in the research community, we're going to have work that we're going to have to do to keep abreast of these things, but also really interesting kind of data access, privacy, and IRB issues with what is our responsibility to understand what's going on in all these smaller communities that are going to become the locus of some of these really difficult societal problems.
Thank you, Alex, for that. And with that, we are at time and I think need to close here, but want to just extend a huge thank you to everyone who has joined us in the audience and everyone here who has taken the time to speak with us today and just to have done such incredible work to help support this really unusual election. Nate, want to turn to you to hear if you have any really last thoughts as the faculty co-director here, and then I will turn quickly to a couple of next steps of upcoming events that we have here at the center. But really, a big thank you to everyone here for what has been a tremendous amount of work this year.
Yeah, I'll just echo the thanks. All of us have, this is the election that keeps on giving, or in some respects keeps on taking, like sapping our souls. And so, just waiting for it to end. So I really appreciate you all taking the time during what is continually a busy time of year for us. And hopefully, the lessons learned here will be useful for strategies in the future. So thanks to everybody, academics, non-academics, and the like. And thank you, Kelly, for organizing all of this.
Yeah, really good to see everyone. And thanks for all of your time. With that, happy holidays in this really odd holiday season. And I will just turn quickly to next steps, which is to note 2 webinars that we have coming up. One on January 13th that will be around the new book, Which Side of History? which Tim Steyer went ahead and has edited on how technology is reshaping democracy in our lives. Renee, I know you contributed a chapter to this, and our colleague Maricha Shake, who is the International Policy Director here at the Cyber Policy Center, has also contributed. So we will be discussing that book in January. And then Maricha will come back again on the 27th to talk about the new Digital Services Act in Europe and help us understand the implications of that. So until then, happy holidays, everyone. And thank you so much again for taking the time today. It was great to learn from all of you as always. All right, take care.